Well, Crofty, we certainly went and created one hell of a rod for our back here, didn't we?
An iron rod, you could say, a cold iron rod.
Yes, a cold iron rod for our backs, fittingly enough. Yeah, we probably should have thought for a few seconds before we decided to cover fairies, probably the most ubiquitous being in all of world folklore ever, in one single episode. That, not the brightest move on our behalf.
When have we ever thought for a few seconds?
Yeah, I mean, it would stop us from writing these exceptionally long scripts that, I don't know about you, I was up until midnight last night writing this, and I was up again at 6 a.m. to start again. So I'm looking forward to this recording being finished.
Only midnight.
So yeah, I can no longer do the days of being a student who inhales a vast quantity of black coffee and stays up all night to finish coursework, which is definitely what I didn't do because I was clearly good at time management. But yes. So today, folks, we have, I think is our second Patreon voted topic for the podcast, which is fairies. The option that I put on the list for patrons to vote on, which is a thing they can do, expecting that it would get the least votes, and we instead would be sat here talking about werewolves.
Yeah, we need to figure out how to rig these polls better to make our lives easier.
Yeah, I mean, I am technically allowed to vote in them on the back end, so I could start doing that, I guess, but enough people vote where that doesn't really make much difference now.
I'm going to need to set up like a few hundred Twitter accounts.
Yeah, just like have a few dummy patron accounts, that should tide us over. But yes, welcome to the show, by the way, which I forgot to introduce once again. This is, of course, the podcast Mythillogical, where we talk about all things folklore and legend. I'm, of course, Charles, King of the Fairies, and I am joined today by Crofty, Queen of the Fairies.
Does this title mean I get to live in an underground realm with no direct sunlight? Because right now I'm experiencing a Japanese summer, and that seems brilliant.
I mean, that's basically how I spent the entire lead-up to recording this episode, was in a strange underground realm, which I may or may not have actually managed to escape from. I'm not 100% sure. But yes, I did actually spend an ungodly amount of time trying to find some sort of way of combining your name with the name of Queen Mab. But the best example I came up with was Queen Crab. So I thought, best leave it.
Yeah, maybe not, huh?
Yeah. So today, folks, we're going to be covering fairies in both their traditional and more modern guises. And I think we need to really start this episode by explaining what we have ultimately decided to do. Because, as I said before, fairies are a gigantic topic. I think there is basically something equivalent to a fairy in the mythologies of just about every inhabited continent, and most of the countries within those continents have their own individual and distinctive bodies of law regarding some sort of unseen or mystical creature. So, trying to do all of this justice would be a bit of a fool's errand on our behalf. I think I explained it to someone recently as it would kind of be like trying to do something similar to what we did for the first couple of Dragons episodes that we did back at the start of this podcast, but maybe 4 or 5 times longer.
Yeah, I'd quit by then.
Yeah. So what we've done instead is we have narrowed down the scope of this episode quite significantly. And what we're going to be doing today is discussing the history of the type of fairies with which we're most familiar, and that is the various fairy traditions of Britain and Ireland. Even then, however, we have had to be quite selective about what we want to cover. For example, I've written about 5,000 words alone on just some of the various types of fairy that are found in Ireland. So this will by no means be an exhaustive list or discussion. So with all that said, I'm going to make the mistake of asking here, Crofty, what was your previous experience with fairies prior to us recording this podcast?
My childhood and a lot of fantasy novels that I read. Basically, 30 years worth.
Yeah, basically I don't think there is a single person in the UK, at least, who hasn't basically been exposed to fairies since before they were born almost. It's just kind of a ubiquitous thing throughout your kind of fairy tales that you're taught in childhood.
Losing the name.
Yeah, there's no getting away from it, basically. So, yeah, bit of a silly question for me to ask in this particular occasion, but we usually ask it for the episode, so I thought it felt kind of right. So, with that obligatory question out of the way, Crofty, do you want to start by giving us a bit of a definition of kind of the image of at least what we would call the modern fairy with which we're all kind of familiar?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Because yes, the modern image is somewhat different. Much like when we talked about vampires, the modern image is somewhat different from what we might find in the folklore. But over the course of the episode, we will see hints of where modern ideas of fairies came from. So, depending on your exposure to modern fiction, your idea of fairies can probably generally be broken into one of two main archetypes. And so I'm going to use two famous examples to illustrate them, namely Tinker Bell and the aforementioned Queen Mab. So Tinker Bell is tiny, usually around 10 to 15 centimetres tall, and is most often seen as a small light zipping around a room too quickly to focus on. When she does hold still and can be observed closely, she's depicted as a pretty young woman with insect wings, which might look like a butterfly or like a dragonfly. The wings give off a glow which lights up the space around her. That glow comes from the fairy dust, which covers her wings, which is the magical substance giving her the ability to fly, and which, if given to humans, such as Peter Pan, can also bestow the power of flight. From the Disney adaptations of Peter Pan onwards, her and similar fairies are generally portrayed as friendly, if sometimes a bit mischievous, and this image has inspired countless fairies in the media aimed at children. Some of these fairies get tasked with granting wishes, some tasked with protecting or being companions to children, and this sort of image is also the one that we associate with the Tooth Fairy, which I assume that's quite common outside of the UK and America, but as far as I know, I don't know how common it is throughout the rest of throughout Europe or other parts of the world.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that one, I must admit.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we grew up with and that I know is popular in America, but I haven't really confirmed elsewhere. So I will, for anyone who doesn't know, just in case, we'll say that the Tooth Fairy is generally taught to children that she will give them money in exchange for a lost tooth that's placed on the pillow at night. Many depictions of these types of fairies will have them connected to a particular child, for example, portrayed by the character of Navi and the forest fairies in The Legend of Zelda. But this benevolent image was not quite J.M. Barrie's original description in Peter Pan, though. It was somewhat sanitised by Disney. Barrie described fairies as being too small to contain more than one feeling at once, and so an angry fairy would become much more malevolent, such as, spoiler alert if you want to read Peter Pan, when Tinker Bell actually tried to murder Wendy. Yeah, I was not expecting that when I went and read Peter Pan for this.
Yeah, I'm going to say that that's something that Disney probably doesn't want out there that much, is that image of Tinker Bell, given that she's kind of one of the sort of mascot characters for Disney in many ways.
Yeah, Mickey Mouse might come after me to silence me for that one.
Yeah, you don't cross the mouse.
No.
Yeah.
So the other fairy archetype that's quite common now, which I will use the figure of Queen Mab as an example of, are vastly different from Tinker Bell. Queen Mab is a figure that originated with William Shakespeare in a long speech in Romeo and Juliet, but modern fiction very much fleshed her out and gave her her own character. So I'm going to be using Queen Mab as portrayed in the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher as the example here. So Queen Mab and similar fairies are often referred to as Fae, usually spelt F-A-E, and they appear as particularly beautiful but otherworldly humans. They are often divided into a very strict hierarchy, the Fae courts, which are ruled over by queens. For example, In Jim Butcher's works, Queen Mab is the Queen of the Court of Winter, or the Unseelie Court, and her opposite number is Queen Titania, who is also known from Shakespeare, who is the Queen of the Summer Court, or the Seelie Court. These types of fae are bound by a number of strict rules in their interactions with the human world, which usually include an inability to lie and a compulsion to honour all agreements or deals that have been made with humans. While they have incredible magical power, they can only use it on humans who have already made a connection with the fairy world, such as making a trade, and so will often have a human intermediary. So, using the Mab example, she has the Winter Knight, who receives power from her in exchange for servitude. These types of fairies have an unfathomable agenda that's not necessarily good and not necessarily evil, but more sort of focused on their strict fixed personalities and roles within their society. And to advance their agenda, they must lure humans into their service. Making a deal or making a promise to these fairies is always warned against, as they are masters of twisting words, saying things that are both completely true and completely misleading. To steal a joke from Terry Pratchett, like lawyers and philosophy professors. And an unwary character will often believe that they're getting what they need from a bargain, only to find that the fairy has held up their end of the deal according to the letter of the deal, but still left the character in need of more aid from them, and so keeping them trapped in a cycle of giving up more and more in exchange for help. We do see other variants less commonly outside of these main two. A fairy court that's ruled by the Queen Mab type may contain other creatures as subordinates, such as pixies or sprites, which do resemble, physically at least, the Tinkerbell type. Or we see small underground creatures such as gnomes, knockers, or brownies, or creatures such as goblins, kelpies or selkies, and basically all kinds of other magical creatures you can think of do sometimes get grouped under the Fae umbrella. Some of them do have folkloric connections to fairies, or are grouped into the fairy folklore, which we will be seeing later on this episode.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in real quickly here and say there's also, this is kind of more common in the early modern period, and like the kind of Renaissance period, where the court kind of revolved more around the twin figures of a king and queen of the fairies, which I will talk a little bit more in terms of its relevance within the literature of those periods.
Yep. And one of the famous fictional fairy that I will mention, just because it's from one of my favourite pieces of media, is the great fairies of the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda, who are quite different from most others in that they are water-dwelling fairies in a pond or a lake or a waterfall, who provide help to the player in the form of health upgrades or equipment, and we'll be seeing a bit more on them later. So the Tinkerbell archetype of fairies is not very common in the folklore. It instead seemed to mostly emerge in Victorian Britain before being popularised by J.M. Barrie in the early 20th century. By this time, belief in fairies was becoming viewed as quite a childish thing, to the point where Barrie wrote into his world that whenever a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," a fairy dies, which will explain the hint that I gave at the end of our previous episode for anyone who didn't get it. The Queen Mab archetype is much closer to what we see in folklore, and while the folklore often doesn't give explicit rules governing their behaviour, as we see laid out in the fiction, there are a lot of folkloric examples where we can see these kinds of rules and beliefs in action that did inspire this popular view of fairies. As I say, the other smaller types that do crop up in the folklore, I believe Charles will be covering some more on later. So, prior to the 19th century, belief in these fairies was quite prevalent throughout society, with at least one documented case of royalty showing belief in fairies and having it affect certain policies that I'll be discussing later on. While scholars and writers of pretty much every generation would often claim that belief in fairies in their time wasn't as strong as in previous generations, these stories would still survive and be told quite widely among commoners and educated people alike.
Yeah, I think I have examples of people in the 13th century saying, "Oh yeah, it's not as strong as it was in previous generations. And then you can like directly go to some guy in the 20th century saying the exact same thing.
Exactly. And with that, I will hand back to you, Charles.
Okay, so thank you, Crofty. So I think at this point, it's probably good for us to detail how we're going to kind of split up and organise the rest of this episode from this point onwards. What we've basically done is I will be covering the historical traditions and fairy folklore in both England and Ireland, whilst Crofty, you're going to be doing the same, but for Scotland and Wales. How I've actually structured my sections is that for the first half, I'm going to be giving a bit of a historical overview of how fairies and related creatures have been viewed in the respective countries I'm going to be talking about. And then I'm going to be using the rest of my sections to dive in and examine some of the more famous examples of fairies in both countries. Crofty, you did send me your notes in advance of this, so am I right in thinking yours is more of a combined sections?
In the Scotland section, it does more focus on the history of it, because in Scotland there was a book written which defined a single type of fairy, and so I'll be working through the history of that. Wales, it will be a bit of a shorter section because we have a fairy that is quite unique to Wales, that is very distinct from just about every other type of fairy, that I'll be going into quite a bit of detail on.
Okay. So, I think at this point we should mention our sources for today's episode. So, I got quite a few here. What I'm going to do is where I have like primary references and stories that I've taken from folkloric collections, I'm going to mention those as I go and give you some details as where you can find them so that you can check out some more examples of fairies if you like. In terms of the kind of more formal academic works that I consulted, I used the monogram Elves in Anglo Saxon England by Dr. Alaric Hall. I used a long paper by Professor Ronald Hutton titled The Making of the Early Modern British Fairy Tradition. Those two works really form the backbone of the materials that I've used for my kind of discussion of history of fairies within England. I also used a bit of the introduction to Folklore and Nation in Britain and Ireland by Dr. Matthew Cheeseman and Dr. Karina Hart. Specifically, I used the sections that talked about the Brothers Grimm and their influence on European folklore as a whole. For some descriptive elements associated with fairies, I used the works An Encyclopedia of Fairies by Dr. Catherine Mary Briggs, along with a few small bits from her gigantic A Dictionary of British Folk Tales in the English Language, which I think runs to like 4 volumes. Alongside this, I also took a few bits from the Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology and Folklore by Professor Patricia Monaghan. That work I did have a few issues with. It's not very great when it comes to its sourcing for a lot of sections. It will sometimes give like a huge amount of claims and just give one general source that doesn't cover all of those claims. So just keep that in mind if you want to go ahead and read that. There are copies of it available completely online. But there are a few bits and pieces in there that I found to be useful and that matched what was said in other accounts that I found. I also used some sections of a Master of Philosophy thesis titled The Motive of the Mermaid in English, Irish and Scottish Fairy and Folk Tales by Stephanie this is a hell of a name, by Stephanie Kickingarida, along with parts of the work The Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger by Professor Patricia Lysacht, and bits of the paper When Did Fairies Get Their Wings by Dr. Simon Young.
For my references today, I've got quite an extensive list, though academic papers are a little thin on the ground this time, I'm afraid. For my section on Wales, I leaned quite heavily once again on Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx by Sir John Rhys. I also used some of Folklore of West and Mid Wales by J. Ceredig Davis. I make brief reference to British Goblins, Welsh Folklore, Fairy Mythology, Legends and Traditions by Wirt Sykes, though quite quickly debunk a lot of what he says. I refer to Welsh Fairy Tales and Other Stories by P.H. Emerson, and Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W. Evans Wentz, all of which are available on Project Gutenberg. For my section on Scotland, I made quite a lot of use of Scottish Fairy Belief, A History by Lisanne Henderson and Edward J. Cowan, available on Kindle. I also referred a lot to The Secret Commonwealth by Robert Kirk, available on sacredtext.com. The Romance and Prophecies of Thomas of Ercildoune by Sir James Augustus Henry Murray, available on Internet Archive. For The Ballad of Tam Lin, I use Ballads of Mystery and Miracle and Fits of Mirth by Frank Sedgwick, available on Project Gutenberg. Demonology by King James VI of Scotland, available on Project Gutenberg.
Yes, we finally got it. I've been waiting for an excuse for someone to mention that book on this series since we basically started. Atunche Films will be proud of us.
Yeah. He does the Witchfinder General character, doesn't he?
Yes, yeah. you have the correct person in mind. Congratulations.
I know my history YouTubers. I've watched more than one.
That's I was going to make a joke about that. That's one more than me, but no. I have seen a good chunk of Andy's work.
Yeah. And for some of the later fairy stories, I use Scottish Fairy and Folk Tales by Sir George Douglas, available on sacredtext.com. I also refer to a paper regarding the Scottish witch trials, Witch, Fairy and Folktale Narratives in the Trial of Bessie Dunlop by Lizanne Henderson. And in addition to that, I did read through the original Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, just for my section on fairies in fiction.
Okay, with that done, let's get into the real meat of today's episode. I want to give a general warning for my section that there's going to be quite a lot of different groups of creatures that I'm including under the category of fairy. This is mostly because these are groups of creatures that later came to be associated with fairies, or that played a potential role in the development of the modern image of the fairy. What I have tried to exclude are a lot of figures who have historically been lumped in with fairies, but to me are more along the lines of ghosts, demons, and the undead. In practice, what I did and didn't choose to exclude ended up being a bit arbitrary, so apologies for that. I also want to note that similar to the episode we did on the Wild Hunt, this is going to be a bit of a point where more academic examination of these subjects is going to fail us, and we're really just going to be relying on the writings of a lot of 19th and 20th century folklorists who collected many of the more notable fairy stories of Britain and Ireland. So, to start my section on England, I want to note that the word fairy did not actually arrive in Britain until the end of the High Middle Ages. However, in England, we do know of the existence of figures prior to the origin of that word that do broadly fit in with the image of the fairy as described in at least one version of Crofty's summary. And these are the figures of the Elves, or in Old English, the Elves, who have been known in England since at least the Anglo Saxon period. Now, as chronicled by Dr. Alaric Hall, the actual references we have to elves dating from this time are often quite brief and at times contradictory. As such, these figures have largely been interpreted based on their equivalent figures in the later Icelandic or Norse sagas, the Alvar. I think I'm saying that correctly. I'm not going to go into these figures too much, simply because the many varied mentions of the Alvar and their Germanic equivalents of the Alps throughout their respective groups of mythologies could probably take up an entire episode by themselves. Briefly, however, in the Icelandic sagas, these figures are marked by being otherworldly, but still human-like creatures, who are held to be separate from more monstrous beings, such as the Jötnar, or the giants, the Furs, or ogres, and, I didn't write down a pronunciation for this, the Dwergar, or Dwerga, which are often equated to the dwarves. In Snorri Sturluson's Poetic Edda, an interesting distinction is made within the Alvar between the Ljósalvar, or light elves, and the Dokkalvar, which are the black or the dark elves. In particular, the Ljósalvar are said to dwell in a place known as Alfheim, or Alfheimer, and to be more handsome than the sun in their appearance, whilst the Dokkalvar live beneath the earth. So one suggestion that Alaric Hall made for this dichotomy is that this may have been a way of accommodating the kind of Christian principles of angels and fallen angels into these figures. So by comparison, there are currently no known examples of Anglo-Saxon stories that feature elves. This may well be due to poor survival of these stories in their manuscript forms, rather than them not existing at all, but sadly we have no way of knowing if this is true. Instead, the most common appearance of this word is as a name element, so for example as part of names like Alfred, Alfric, and Alfwine. In these cases, its use can be quite ambiguous. For example, Alfwine means elf friend, though it's not certain whether this is meant to mean a person who could befriend elves, or if this name was meant more as a gesture to protect them from their wrath. These figures also frequently appear in medical texts from the time, and the main characteristics that we can pick up from these is that elves were generally feared and that they were seen as a potential source of misfortune and illness to humans and livestock. So an example of this can be seen in a text known as the Whiff Fairies, which is a charm meant to cure a violent twitching pain which is inflicted by elfshot, or alternatively by seers or the Aesir of Norse mythology. Outside of these two pieces of evidence, perhaps the most notable mention of elves from this period is in the poem Beowulf, where they are included amongst the evil descendants of the biblical Cain. To quote from Seamus Heaney's translation, "Out of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too who strove with God." This passage does stand somewhat at odds with the later Norse idea that elves were somehow separate from more monstrous beings. It may well be the case that either these traditions varied between the regions, or the idea that elves were distinct from more monstrous beings had not yet developed. And just to muddle the water a little bit more, it is in addition to these negative aspects that elves may also have been occasionally presented as models of seductive female beauty. So the main example of this that Alaric Hall cites is the use of the word elfshine, or elf beautiful, in Old English glosses, that are written to explain the Latin word nymphs in texts, which, in classical mythology, were a group of beautiful supernatural women. However, despite this, both Alaric Hall and Ronald Hutton have argued that it is not clear that elves were considered inherently supernatural at this time. And probably the biggest takeaway that I got from all this is that there just doesn't seem to have been a particularly coherent tradition of elves within Anglo Saxon England, or if there was one, then we just lack the surviving text to substantiate it. So to find our more extensive descriptions of elves in England, we have to move forward to texts dating from roughly the 12th century onwards. These include folk stories collected in the works of figures such as Giraldus of Wales, Walter Map, William of Newburgh, Ralph of Coggleshaw, and Gervase of Tilby, each of which relates stories of encounters with supernatural beings that fall somewhat outside of Christian concepts of angels and demons. From these works, it seems that, much like the preceding Anglo-Saxon period, there was still no single unified idea of what an elf was, and instead the stories of these figures are associated with a number of varying motifs that would become common in later fairy stories. These include the belief that these figures are longer lived than humans, and in some ways superior, that they inhabit a parallel world from which they are able to enter ours, and which humans are in turn occasionally able to visit, and of course that they are associated with the colour green. Other motifs include the figures giving blessings to those that entertain them, inflicting misfortune on others, and even going so far as to abduct human children from time to time. And to illustrate pretty much all of these motifs, I'd like to read an example that's recorded in Gerald of Wales' Itinerarium Cambriae, or A Journey Through Wales. So for context, Giraldus was a Cambro-Norman clergyman and writer who actually lived outside of Wales for most of his career. However, in 1888, he did undertake a tour of Wales as part of recruiting efforts for the Third Crusade by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, and he would go on to write an account of this journey. So Giraldus claims to have received this story from a priest named Elodere, and the story goes that when this priest was a young man of only 12, he tired of the harsh discipline of his teacher and ran away to hide beneath a riverbank. 2 days passed without him being found, during which he had nothing at all to eat. 2 tiny green men then appeared before him and said, "If you come away with us, we will take you to a land where all is playtime and pleasure." The boy agreed, and the 2 tiny men led him through a dark underground tunnel into a pleasant land of rivers, meadows, woodlands, and plains. The sun did not shine there, all the days were overcast, and at night there was no moon or stars for light. The 2 men took the boy to their king and his court, who were described as being similarly tiny but beautiful, being fair of face, long of hair, and well proportioned. So after staring at Elodere in astonishment for a while, the king handed the boy over to his own son to be taken care of. Whilst there, the boy learned a great deal about their lives and philosophy. He saw that they never ate meat or fish, instead subsisting on a diet of milk dishes, that they abhorred lies and theft, and that they had no use for public worship and were contemptuous of the ways of the people in the world above. Often the boy would return home using either the tunnel the men had brought him down, or by other ways. On one of these return visits, he told his mother of the little world's existence, and she asked him to bring back some of the gold that was common there. Elidor then returned underground and stole a golden ball that he had previously used when playing with the king's son, and ran back to his mother with the little people in pursuit. As he was crossing the threshold of his mother's house, he tripped, sending the ball rolling from his hand. Two of the little men rushed past him and seized it, showing him every sign of contempt and anger, and then ran off with it. Realizing that he had done a foolish thing, Elidor retraced his steps to the riverbank, where he had first encountered the little men. Here he found that the tunnel he had used had disappeared, as had all other entrances to the underground realm. From that day on, he never once found a way back down there, and eventually he resumed his studies and went on to become a priest. When asked as an old man to recite the story, however, he would burst into tears as he went, and according to Giraldus, he could still remember and recite a great number of words from the little people's language. So an additional motif from this time are stories that involve beautiful supernatural women who are known to dance and sing at night in forests and other secluded places. In these tales, these figures are often encountered by men who then either attempt to woo or abduct them. In the end, however, these stories usually end with the woman either escaping the man and returning to her original world, or with a more alarming variant where, as the two are having sex, she turns into a monster. So, that scene from The Shining, but a few centuries in advance. So I have a short example from the opening of a story contained in Walter Map's De Nugis Curialcum. So again, to give a bit of context, Walter Map was an English courtier who, similar to Giraldus of Wales, was of Welsh descent, who travelled widely throughout Western Europe, and who wrote a work of anecdotes regarding his experiences. In this story, we are told that a man named Wastin Wastinuach, which is an interesting name, stayed one night by the lake of Brechinauch, where on 3 clear moonlights he saw bands of women dancing in the oat fields. On each night he followed them until they escaped by plunging into the water of the lake. On the 4th night, however, he succeeded in capturing one of the women, who yielded and agreed to marry him, promising that, quote, "I will gladly serve you and obey you with all devotion till the day when you're about to rush out at the shouting beyond the Levam," which is a river that was near the lake, "and strike me with your bridle." Many years later, after the couple had had many, many children, we are told that this is exactly what happened. The woman fled with their children after being struck by Wastin with his bridle, and he was only able to catch one of his sons whilst the rest escaped. A short account of the second variety I mentioned is also found in Giraldus of Wales' work again. Here he mentions that in the neighbourhood of the town of Caerleon in southern Wales, there lived a man named Malarius who had acquired knowledge of future and occult events from an encounter with such a woman. We are told that on the night of Palm Sunday, he met a woman who he had long loved in a pleasant and convenient place. Whilst making love to her, he suddenly found in his arms a hairy, rough, and hideous monster, the sight of which turned him quite mad. He remained this way for many years, until eventually he was cured by the Church of St. David's. However, having always had an extraordinary familiarity with, quote, unclean spirits, he found himself able to foretell future events through these spirits' assistance. So what I find kind of interesting about this group of stories is that not all of them condemn the spirits or entities seen within their stories. So that last story I mentioned from Giraldus did have some hints of disapproval, but in both his earlier account and in others, these beings are often presented in pretty much a neutral light, often been reported in more of a here's a thing that happened sort of fashion. As noted by Alaric Hall, we also see no signs of the earlier Anglo Saxon tradition that elves could inflict illness on humans, and indeed this would not really become another common trope associated with the later fairies until the Elizabethan period. The last thing I want to say about these accounts is that it's notable that there seems to be little formal attempt in them to give any sort of origin story or explanation to these creatures, beyond just vague mentions of them being spirits of some type. In the case of the kind of supernatural lovers archetype that we saw, there is the occasional tendency to equate these accounts with male and female versions of creatures known as incubi and succubi. So, for anyone unaware, these figures are said to be demons that seek out sexual intercourse with men and women. And probably the most famous literary example of this from the period is how in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, the Historia Regum Britanniae, the wizard Merlin is said to have been sired by an incubus, which is the source of his prophetic powers. So, figures following these general archetypes continue to appear in folkloric accounts in the centuries after these authors. At this point, however, what I really want to do is to branch off and examine the development of the more literary figure of the fairy, with which we are all kind of more familiar. That's because at the same time that these early authors were writing their accounts, we also see a significant development of fairy figures in Romance literature throughout northwestern Europe. In these works, we see encounters between mortals and what are described as somewhat human-like creatures, who are seen to possess wealth and magical powers, and who function as lovers, counsellors, and protectors. A particular importance has been placed on the appearance of these figures in a number of French works that date from this period, such as Tidorel, Clarice et Laris, and The Bell in Connu. And it's because it's these works that really represent the linguistic root of the word fairy, coming from the word fae. According to Ronald Hutton, by the way of Professor Noel Williams, this word was used in these works more as a verb than a noun, to denote something that was strange and magical, and the derived term of fairy similarly was initially used to refer to strange phenomena rather than to beings. The most influential work from this period, however, is the work Huon de Bordeaux, a 13th century epic poem that features a dwarf king named Oberon, whose name would go on to become a common one for the king of the fairies. In this tale, Oberon is presented as the ruler of a forest kingdom, and he is described as having an angelic visage and possessing great wealth and magical power. However, he is also described as only being 3 feet tall, and also as being possessed of crooked shoulders. This is interesting because, as we kind of touched on in Crofty's opening summary, diminutive stature is a common trait of some types of modern fairies. In Oberon's case, though, this is not due to him being a fairy or an elf, but is due to a curse that is laid upon him at his christening. Despite this example and the earlier story I gave from Geraldus of Wales, as far as I can tell, the common trope of fairies being tiny in literature and folklore is in fact a later development from kind of the Elizabethan period onwards, and particularly becoming a formal aspect of folklore from the Victorian period. So, the final thing to say about these works is that, like the earlier appearances of elves in English literature at the time, they don't really go out of their way to provide an explanation for these figures, and the closest thing that we have to an origin is that some of them are described as humans who somehow acquired magical powers, rather than being supernatural themselves. So to move us along a little, in the centuries ahead, things do begin to evolve. By the end of the late medieval period, the term puck, which had existed since at least Anglo Saxon times, started to become a name for an entity that would lead nocturnal travellers into bogs, as did the term bug and a bunch of derived terms that I will talk about a little bit later. This period is also marked by the arrival of the similar term of goblin from France in the 14th century, and during this time a number of works do appear that attempt to formalise the origins of these creatures within more of a Christian framework. These include works such as the South English Legendary, Robert of Gloucester's Metrical Chronicle, and the Preacher's Manual, the Fasciculus Morum. These works largely define elves, or elven, as former angels who were banished to earth after remaining neutral during Lucifer's revolt. Here, in a devilish illusion, they are then said to have taken on the shape of beautiful women, a la the fairy lover motif, and go on to dance and play in wild places. It is also during the late 14th century that we see the emergence of another major fairy archetype, and this is the fairy kingdom. Early examples of this can be seen in works such as the poetic lay, Sir Orfeo, in which the titular main character has to retrieve his wife from the fair green land of the King of Fair. I think Orfeo is actually a retelling of the myth of Orpheus, so yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of replacing the land of the fairies for the land of the underworld and Pluto in kind of Greek mythology. A similar fairy kingdom is also alluded to in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, particularly in the Wife of Bath's tale, which describes in lines 857 through 861 how in the time of King Arthur, Britain was full of faerie, and where the elf queen with her jolly company danced full often in many a green mead. Finally, during the 15th century, the term fairy largely replaces the English term elf in both literary and popular accounts, and it is from this point onwards that the fairy kingdom seems to have made its way into the consciousness of English commoners. As evidence of this later point, Ronald Hutton cites examples of criminal cases from the period, which include individuals in Kent and Essex going by the names of the Queen of the Fairies and servants of the Queen of the Fairies. There are also similar accounts of women being tried in Somerset and Suffolk during this period for claiming to have magical powers that were disposed on them by, quote, the cunning or the wise folks, and spirits of air, which the common people call fairy. So to kind of push along our discussion on the development of literary fairies and somewhat conclude it, in the 16th and 17th centuries, we see perhaps the largest boom in fairy popularity throughout English and wider British history, which continued onwards into the Victorian period and beyond. It is during this time that fairyland came to function as the embodiment of both hedonism and of the theme of Merry England. In particular, the fairy activities of song and dance made them quite a favourite of authors and playwrights alike during this period. It is also during this time that the fairy court took on its recognisably modern form, as presented most famously in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here we see an opulent and leisurely court that is largely free from the concerns of mortals, ruled over by the fairy king of Oberon, along with his queen Titania, who I believe is not actually an earlier folkloric figure of any type, and instead Shakespeare seems to have taken her name from Ovid's Metamorphoses. This play also features the common fairy trope of the changeling, and notably features the character of Puck, who is also called here under the name of Robin Goodfellow, which is a name which I will discuss in more detail shortly. Crofty, you also mentioned that in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare introduces the figure of Queen Mab, and I think from what you showed me of your notes, you're going to go more into some spurious attempts to associate her with earlier folkloric figures as well in Wales.
Only the one, and I debunk it very quickly.
Yeah. Outside of these literary representations, the cult that surrounded Queen Elizabeth I during this period also involved some of the imagery of the fairy monarch, with her occasionally being presented in the guise of such a monarch, or as receiving the homage of such figures. This is perhaps most evoked by Edmund Spenser's allegorical poem, The Fairy Queen, which, by all accounts, was a really blatant effort by him just to garner the Queen's favour, and it worked. He was rewarded by the Queen for it with a lifetime pension, £50 a year. There is no actual evidence, though, that she ever actually read it. So it may be more a case of the theatrics involved here, rather than him actually genuinely producing a work that pleased her. These trends also continued into the reign of her successor, James I, who, despite having spent a good chunk of his previous rule in Scotland persecuting people for their association with fairies, he was apparently well enough inclined towards the English cultural interest in fairies after he acceded to the throne there, that he raised no objection to his oldest son and then heir, Prince Henry, playing Oberon himself in a performance of the entertainment at Althorp. And Crofty, I think you're going to go into quite a bit more detail about some of the things which James I thought about fairies.
Yeah, which is quite different from what we see once he becomes King of England.
Yeah, there's a kind of a thread alongside all of this which I kind of had to leave out for time, which is that there is also a history of people being persecuted for association with the fairies. That's really going to be more of a part of your discussion in Scotland.
Yeah, it has a big impact on the history. So.
Finally, according to Ronald Hutton, it is also during the late Elizabethan period that the idea that the fairies would reward people for good acts and punish people for bad acts began to appear both in literature and then eventually made its way into folklore. So, for example, the older motif of a household helper kind of evolved, so that these fairies would generally reward people who did their chores whilst punishing the lazy, whilst creatures such as Puck were said to aid the victims of wrongdoing and to punish and waylay those who inflicted harm on others. And it's also kind of during this period that the idea that fairies can be placated by an offering kind of takes form as well, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So that wraps up everything I have to do with the literary figures of fairies going into at least the early modern period. From here on out, I want to turn my attention to the more modern practice of collecting folkloric fairy tales in England. Now, as best I can tell, modern interest in collecting English fairy folk tales largely began in the early 19th century and coincided with the rise of the Romantic movement, which led to an increased interest in the cultural value of folk tales and legends. As with many other nations, this interest was greatly influenced by the 1816 and 1818 publication of the two-volume work Deutsche Sagen, or German Legends, by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, which contained over 300 tales that included figures such as the Wild Hunt, Frau Holl, dwarves, giants, kobolds, ghosts, oh my. In folklorist circles, people tend to focus on the importance of their earlier collection, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, now generally known as Grimm's fairy tales. However, we should note that during their lifetime, they were more commonly cited for their work of German legends, along with various medieval poems and their translation of the Poetic Ada. The popularity of this volume led to the publication of similar collections of legends and fairy tales over the next couple of decades in places such as Denmark, Norway, and Ireland. These collections usually drew upon a mixture of written and oral accounts, and as the decades went by, a greater emphasis came to be placed on the oral accounts. The popularity of translations of the Nordic tales in particular also led to the publication of similar collections in Scotland during the 1860s, such as John Francis Campbell's Popular Tales of the West Highlands. In many of these countries that I previously mentioned, these tales were explicitly organised into what have been termed national collections, to kind of emphasise the idea that these tales in some way belonged to and were part of the essence of the country from which they were compiled. For anyone wondering at home, this does kind of coincide with the emergence of ideas of European nationalism, which I'm not really going to go into here, but that is one of the reasons. By comparison, there was no equivalent collection of quote-unquote national English folklore that were published during this time, despite a few efforts by various scholars. Instead, the various collections that come from this time tend to focus purely on local legends that were collected in England's individual regions. Translated versions of many of the other European collections I mentioned before also became widely popular in England during this time, which in turn helped fuel something of a boom in literary fairy tales for children during the Victorian period. So this is really where the idea of children's literature being entertainment for children kind of took off as well. Beforehand, it was kind of viewed more as a moralistic or educational form of literature. Probably the most famous examples of fairy stories from this period include things like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and Andrew Lang's collection of 25 fairy books, which included a mixture of fictional and actual folkloric stories, and of which probably his Blue Fairy book is probably the most famous. During this time, we also have international examples, such as Hans Christian Andersen's 3-part series, Fairy Tales for Children, which includes stories such as Thumbelina, The Little Mermaid, and The Emperor's New Clothes. Finally, over a century later in 1970, such a national attempt at compiling English, or more broadly British, folklore finally bore fruit with Catherine Briggs' massive work, which I mentioned beforehand, the Dictionary of British Folk Tales in the English Language. that is a very heavily summarised overview of the various folkloric and literary understandings of fairies throughout English history. I will warn I skipped over just vast chunks of this history just to get this to a length where my lungs wouldn't explode. And it's probably still too long despite all my efforts. Apologies, Crofty, for making you sit through that for so long. For the rest of my section, I'd like to talk about a few of the major groups of fairies within English folkloric tradition. Generally, the fairy traditions of England vary wildly from region to region, and whilst neighbouring regions might have similar folkloric creatures, often they have differing attributes and differing names. There are, however, a few common traits that are shared by the more generic forms of fairies, some of which have come up before. These include an association with the colour of green, a preoccupation with dancing, a tendency to steal or borrow food and tools, an act known as fairy borrowing, and an aversion occasionally to salt and charms. I did initially have written down here that fairies have an aversion to cold iron. However, as best I can tell, this largely was popularised by the works of Rudyard Kipling, rather than being much of a folkloric thing in England. Crofty, you have a few examples of it existing to some extent in Welsh folklore, though, I believe.
Yeah, just a few specific mentions to iron.
In addition to this, fairies are also said to make and dwell within fairy rings, a concept which, according to Alaric, does in fact date back, in England at least, to around 1300. These are commonly said to take the form of circles of odd-coloured grass created by fairy dancing that are often marked by rings of daisies or mushrooms. In modern times, we know these to be due to a phenomena of one of the ways which fungi grow, but that is a very common trope within fairy stories. In addition to these rings, they are also often associated with ancient ruins and monuments. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the various Irish fairy tradition, as their version of fairies are also strongly associated with these sorts of structures, and their examples also tie in a bit more with wider Irish mythology. Finally, fairies are often said to be both winged and diminutive. So one thing I was surprised to find out in the course of my research is that whilst we're very familiar these days with the ideas of fairies having wings, in the case of both English literature and folklore, this is in fact something of a late development. According to Dr. Simon Young, outside of a few examples of Elizabethan and Jacobean is the word?
I think so, yeah. Jacobean.
Yeah. Outside of a few examples of Elizabethan and Jacobean illustrations, there is actually limited evidence for winged fairies prior to the 19th century. The big exception to this is that in the 18th century, we do have the examples of winged sylphs, which are in form of air spirit. This image is one that was largely popularised by Alexander Pope's work, The Rape of Loch. However, the literary image of the winged fairy only really appears to have become broadly popular in the Victorian period, where it developed in line with the increased popularity of children's fairy tales. It's one of the kind of moves that was made to make these figures less quote-unquote scary to children, and this trait has then seeped into folklore from that point onwards. With regards to fairies being small, the story is a bit more mixed. We do have the example I mentioned before, dating back to Geraldus of Wales, of elven figures being extremely small, and it was not uncommon for fairies to be imagined as insect-sized creatures in the early modern period. However, the widespread adoption of their diminutive stature, again, seems to be largely a consequence of their literary depictions in the Victorian era. So, to demonstrate many of these generic fairy tropes, I'm going to discuss them through the lens of a creature that is commonly equated to the fairy. This is the pixie, also known as the pigsy or the pisky, which historically is the term used for fairy-like beings in the West Country of England, particularly in Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and occasionally southern Wales. Like other fairies, these creatures assume a number of forms. Often they are described as having pointed ears, red hair, short faces, and upturned noses. In some tales, they are described as handsome, in others plain, and they are often described as diminutive, or at least as being clearly recognisable even when they are not small. According to Dr. Patricia Monaghan's The Encyclopedia of Celtic Mythology, in Cornwall the pisky was generally described as being shorter, older, and more wizened than the broader regional interpretation of the pixie, Of all their different variations, however, they are almost always said to be associated with the colour of green, and similar to creatures such as Puck, they have a fondness for waylaying travellers and leading them into bogs and other dangers. Individuals who are tricked in this manner are said to be pixie-led, or fairy-led in more broader traditions, and a common way to avoid this was said to be to turn your coat or shirt inside out, or to carry a piece of bread or a Wiccan cross with you. A common story of these creatures' origins is that they are the souls of unbaptized children, and they are said to dwell within prehistoric monuments, which are often described as fairy forts, as pixie holes, or piskies crows. Crow in this case meaning shed or hovel. Pixies also have a somewhat unique way of forming their fairy rings, or galatraps as they are known, which is that they are said to steal horses at night and to ride them around in circles. If anyone is to be misfortunate enough to place a single foot within one of these circles, then they will be able to see the pixies dancing, but if they make the mistake of putting both feet in, then they will almost certainly be captured. This is part of a broader theme of fairy circles generally being a dangerous thing to associate with. And on a slightly more grim note, it is said that any criminal who puts his foot within a galatrap will instead be hanged. So to showcase pixies in their more mischievous bent, I have a quick couple of stories that I have summarised from the work Tales of the Dartmoor Pixies by William Crossing. The first tale is named Rewarding a Pixie. This is a trait of a lot of these early folkloric collections where they just have extremely simple titles. So one morning, a moor farmer goes to his barn to thresh the corn that he had left there. On opening the door, however, he finds that someone else has already threshed a good day's worth of his corn and has also swept the floor clean. He goes to his wife and asks her if she knows what caused this, and she unhesitantly states that it was a pixie. The man felt much obliged to this creature, who had relieved him of the burden of work for that day. The next day, he goes to the barn once more, and he again finds a day worth of threshing had been done. After pondering this for a while, he decides to keep a watch on the barn, so that he can see how these folk have been accomplishing this task. In the small hours of the morning, he went to the barn and hid himself in the straw. As daylight began to appear, he heard a rustling sound in a corner, then suddenly saw a small figure who commenced to thresh and stack the corn with, quote, great speed and gusto, before quickly disappearing. The farmer then rushed to tell his wife of what had occurred. To reward the pixie for his help, the couple decided to make him a new set of clothes to replace the green rags that he had been wearing. By supper time, the little suit was ready, and the next morning before daybreak, the man placed it on the barn floor and hid himself again in the straw. At the first sign of daylight, the little man then appeared as before, and the man watched him from the straw, picturing the pleasure that the little man would no doubt manifest on seeing his labours so rewarded. Indeed, the pixie went right up to the clothes and quickly put them on. Looking down at himself with pride, he said, "New tote, new waistcoat, new breeches, you proud, I shan't work any more." He then vanished, never to be seen again, and the farmer was obliged to thresh his own corn from then on. As it turns out that much like various puck figures that we're going to be talking about later, gifting a pixie with clothes is in fact a surefire way to get them to leave. The second story I have is titled Nanny Norrish and the Pixies. So many decades back, we are told that there was a woman named Nanny Norrish who was married to a village schoolkeeper in Widdicombe parish. Unfortunately, Mr. Norrish was disabled, and as such, Nanny would work as a washerwoman so that they might make ends meet. Nanny was known far and wide for her good temper and strong work ethic, and she was happy to walk many miles across the moor to find work, be it summer, winter, or even night. Often her neighbours would ask her why she was not afraid to go out late at night and risk being pixie-led, and she would scoff at them, saying, "Piskies indeed. I can't believe what they say about mun. I never seed one, and what's more, if I did, I shouldn't be afeard." So one night, when Nanny had finished her work at a farmhouse, the family she had worked for bade her farewell and told her to be careful not to be led astray by the pixies. Nanny replied by saying, "Oh, drat the pixies. I don't believe there's one left. I've heard of folks having seed one. I can't believe it till I see one for myself, but I know I shall never do that. The pixies heard this, as they had heard her jeer at them before. On those occasions, they chose to let her be, as despite her words, she had done them no actual harm. That night, however, they decided to teach her a lesson, so that she might speak more respectfully of them in the future. As Nanny trudged on, she was suddenly startled by a loud hubbub of numberless shrill voices, quote, making such a clatter as you have never heard. She stopped, but before she could collect herself, a great crowd of little people appeared before her, standing on each other's heads and forming a pyramid that towered above her. On and on the pixies climbed higher, chattering as they went, and that night Nanny Norrish knew that she had met the pixies at last. The story then ends by simply saying that the records don't tell us if Nanny ever got home that night, but presumably she did so, as the pixies only wished to teach her a lesson rather than harm her. And the moral of the story is that if you don't want to be waylaid by the pixies, maybe don't pretend to despise them. So, I think the pixies are kind of a good lens from which to view the more generic forms of English fairy. To round off the remainder of my section, I'm now just going to give a quick couple of examples of more solitary creatures that I feel contribute to the flavour of England's various varieties of fairy. So the first of these is the figure of the fairy changeling, which according to Dr. Catherine Briggs is one of the most common types of fairy story throughout Britain, which are found throughout northern England and the Scottish lowland region. It is also likely a very old archetype, as we have what resemble proto-versions of changeling stories in the works of Ralph of Coggeshall and Gervase of Tilbury. This fairy tale type is also found in Ireland and many other European countries, but as Crofty, you mentioned to me that you haven't really covered them much in your sections on either Wales or Scotland, and as I have a ton of other creatures to cover in Ireland anyway, I thought I'd cover it here.
Okay.
For anyone unfamiliar, changelings are usually said to be fairy children that are deliberately swapped for human children, particularly unbaptized ones. The replacements are often said to be withered and ugly, resembling an old person rather than a babe, and it is common that they then do not thrive. Sometimes they are said to be an adult male fairy in disguise, whilst on other occasions they are in fact only a piece of wood with a glamour that makes them to appear to be alive for a time. There are various traditions of what happens to the human child once abducted. Sometimes it is said that they are taken to pay a thief to the devil, that they are taken purely because of their beauty, or simply that they are taken to reinforce the fairy stock, as a child raised by the fairies becomes a fairy itself. However, once a child has been abducted, all hope is not lost, and there are indeed ways to get it back. And to demonstrate perhaps the most common method of doing this, I'd like to read for you a summary of the aptly titled story of The Changeling, taken from Catherine Briggs' Dictionary of British Folk Tales. So one day, a certain woman, who had put out her child for nursing, came to take it home, but found it so greatly altered and unpleasant that she scarcely knew it. Not knowing what to do, she took it home and kept it, but after several years had passed, it could neither speak nor walk, and the woman found herself struggling to carry it in her arms. One day an old man came to the door begging, and she related to him all of her misfortune, adding that she thought the babe was changed, and none of it was hers. The old beggar told her how to find the truth, that she should make a fire, sweep the hearth very clean, and place the child fast within his chair so that he might not fall. She was then to break a dozen eggs and place their half shells before the child, then to go out and listen at the door, for if it was a changeling, it would be sure to speak. The woman did as the old man bid, and as she crouched by the door, she heard the babe say, 7 years old was I before I came to the nurse, and 4 years I have lived since, and never saw so many milk pans before. The woman then snatched up the changeling, and on the old man's instructions, she took it to the dunghill, I presume means a refuse tip, and left it there to cry. Eventually, she could hear it no longer, and on returning to the dung heap, she found her own hale and hearty child returned. Another variant on this tale is that once the changeling has been revealed using the eggshell on the hearth method, it should be thrown in the fire where it will fly up the chimney laughing and shrieking. In some versions of these tales, the true child will then appear at the door, and all's well that ends well. I also encountered another much more direct way of reclaiming your child from the fairies, which is taken from an Irish collection, namely Lady Wilde's The Ancient Legends of Ireland, and this story is also titled The Changeling. Very briefly, in this tale, a couple have their child stolen by a tall, dark woman and an old hag, and replaced with a misshapen, sickly-looking creature. Soon after, they meet a young fairy woman, who reveals that the pair left the couple with her own child, which they had also stolen in order to make the switch. She then instructs them to go to the hill where the fairies are said to live, and to burn 3 sheaves there, one by one, and as the third one lies burning, to threaten to burn down everything that grows on the hill. The couple do so, and the fairies immediately fold and return their child. According to Catherine Briggs' Encyclopedia of Fairies, this method is also known to be used to reclaim adults that have similarly been taken by fairies and replaced with a simulacrum. Before I move on, it does behoove me to acknowledge that there is an unfortunate dark side of this tradition, which is that there is evidence that belief in changelings has historically led to the abuse and even deaths of children who were born with illnesses and disabilities as recently as the early 20th century. I don't really want to go into this, again, because I've been talking for a long time already, and I don't want to make the episode more grim than it has to be, given some of the things Crofty's probably going to discuss in his Scottish section. But Catherine Brigg does give some historical examples of this in her aforementioned encyclopedia, if anyone wants to look into that further. I think it's also discussed in Ronald Hutton's book The Witch, and I'm sure there's plenty of literature on these instances out there. Moving along, the last figure that I would like to cover as part of my section is Puck, and the wider group of figures which he often represents. As I covered before, much like with elves, the actual word Puck long predates that of the fairy in England, dating back to at least Anglo Saxon times. And from the 16th century onwards, he also came to be known under the name of Robin Goodfellow. According to Ronald Hutton, this name is first known to have been used in a series of 15th century letters between members of the aristocratic Paston family, which is, I understand, is like a collection of letters that is considered one of the major sources on day-to-day life in the period. Specifically, this name is used in a throwaway line as part of a rebel's proclamation, which reads, "And this is in the name of Master Hobhrist, Robin Goodfellow's brodeer he is, as I trow." So that is written in kind of Middle English. It's a little hard to understand. Later in 1531, this name would be used to describe more of a Puck-like entity by the biblical scholar William Tyndale in his work The Exposition of the First Epistle of St. John, where he writes of people who attempt to read scripture with inadequate training that they grope for the door and can find no way in, and is become a maze unto them, in which they wander as in a mist, or, as we say, led by Robin Goodfellow, that they cannot come to the right way, no. Then finally, in 1595 or 1596, we're not sure exactly which, this figure made perhaps his most famous appearance as the prankster of A Midsummer Night's Dream, in which he is variously named as Puck, Robin Goodfellow, and is also described as a hobgoblin. Now, in later literature and folklore, this figure became somewhat synonymous with a wider group of trickster figures, sometimes described as fairies, demons, or nature spirits, who were known to waylay or inconvenience humans, particularly those who travelled at night. In addition to the previously mentioned goblins and hobgoblins, the latter of which were also known as hobs or lobs, we also have creatures such as the brownie, the bugaboo, the boggle, and imps, which are mostly described as various different forms of small, ugly humanoids, many of which are said to be hairy. I haven't really gone into this because it's kind of a fool's endeavour, but there are also a vast number of derived regional terms for creatures similar to this description throughout Britain, and often these cross over to include other types of supernatural entity, including things such as spectral dogs and spirits. So a good example is in my neck of the woods, there is an entity known as the Padfoot, which in some of the various encyclopedias and dictionaries that I consulted for this episode, is often lumped in with creatures like hobgoblins or bogies. However, in practice, I found that its descriptions are actually closer to something like a bargest or a black dog that you often see within English folklore, and indeed it appears more in the guise of a death messenger rather than a trickster. Now, in terms of the disposition of these creatures towards humans, their most common trait, which we've talked a little bit about before, is that they are greatly entertained by waylaying people through their various misdeeds. So, a good example of such antics can be found in the popular early 17th century broadside ballad, which is titled The Mad Merry Pranks of Robin Goodfellow, in which he is described as a merry sprite and as an emissary of King Oberon. So in the course of this ballad, which is kind of sung from his perspective, he brags of waylaying travellers, stealing food from gatherings, of blowing out candles so that he can kiss maids, of stripping people of their bedclothes at night so he can leave them, quote, naked to view, and of pushing people out of bed onto the cold floor. However, at the same time, he also mentions that he helps out with some of the household tasks, and even lends help to those in need, though woe betide those who fail to repay him. So if you want to have a look into that ballad yourself, it is available in its entirety online, and I feel it gives a good distillation of the hobgoblin's prankster nature. However, I think at this point, I should just quickly note that according to Catherine Briggs' Encyclopedia of Fairies, there is a worthwhile distinction to be made between the sort of pranks that the hobgoblin would make, which are more along the lines of annoyances rather than lasting harm to the person that they afflict, and the more malevolent disposition of creatures such as goblins, imps, and boggles. In the various retellings that I was able to find, these creatures are usually much more hostile towards humans and are generally best avoided. And I actually came across a particularly nasty example of one of these sorts of creatures, which is the figure known as the Red Cap. So, according to William Henderson's 19th century work, Notes on the Folklore of the Northern Countries of England and the Borders, this figure is described as a cruel and malignant fairy who resides in the ruined castles and towers of the borderlands between England and Scotland. He is described as a short, stout old man who is dressed in iron boots, wears a red hat, and carries a pikestaff. In addition, he is also marked by his large teeth, his long taloned fingers, his red eyes, often described to be the colour of fire, and his long, grisly hair. This figure is said to hurl rocks at any who dare to take refuge in one of his haunts, and often to outright murder them and catch their blood in his hat. So that's where the Red Cap name comes from. Now, alongside these more nefarious elements, as you may have noticed as part of me discussing the ballad from before, in many folkloric traditions, these creatures occupy more of a household role. It is in this guise that they can actually be quite helpful entities, and it is this role that I want to focus on for the rest of my section. So the most common example of this sort of household spirit is probably the brownie. So stories surrounding this creature can be found throughout a wide swath of Britain, including all over the Scottish border region and the Highlands, northeastern England, and also in the Midlands. Like the pixie, the brownie is said to do household and farm work at night, which includes tidying up rooms, threshing corn, and even shepherding and helping with animals. In some tales, these figures are invisible, whilst in others they are visualized as a short, hairy man who may also be quite rotund and who is usually dressed in rags. In stories where the brownie is visible, he is sometimes employed as an advisor or a confidant, and often becomes quite attached to a specific member of the household and shows favoritism towards them. So an example of this is if a brownie became attached to the master of the household, he would be quite happy to snitch on any of the servants if they were to shirk any of their duties. Now, according to Catherine Briggs, in return for these sorts of services, the brownie had the right to a bowl of the best cream or milk in the household, or to a good cake or bannock. which, for anyone unfamiliar, because I was unfamiliar before we recorded this, is a type of Scottish flatbread. However, it is considered crucial that the person who leaves this offering does so by simply leaving it out somewhere within reach of the creature, rather than giving it to the brownie directly. This is because any direct reward for a brownie's service was considered the ultimate taboo, which would almost certainly result in the creature quitting the household for good. There are various different explanations for this taboo. In many stories, it is because the creature is said to be the subject of a curse that forced him to labour on others' behalf until he was rewarded, or alternatively, that the curse prevents him from taking any payment, and as a result, he is forced to leave. An alternative to this is that this taboo is sometimes said to be due to the creature being offended by the quality of the goods given to him, which causes him to take insult. And, as we're about to see, the last thing that you want to do is to offend a brownie, as doing so may cause him to turn into the final creature that I want to mention as part of my discussion of the more solitary fairies, and this is the boggart. So, within more recent pop culture, I expect a lot of people will be familiar with this creature in its guise as a shapeshifter that takes on the form of the observer's deepest fear, often leaving its own true form hidden. Whilst in many folkloric traditions this creature is indeed described as a shapeshifter, in most tales the boggart is instead presented more in the vein of a malevolent household spirit, whose actions are similar to those of a poltergeist, and who is often said to be a mischievous brownie that has been offended in some manner. So as an example of this, in the story of the Brownie of Cranshaw's, an industrious brownie is seen to turn into a boggart after its local community begins to take its services for granted. One day, the creature overhears someone remark that the corn he had harvested was not well mown, nor well stacked, and that night the brownie scatters the corn, muttering to himself, "It's no well mowed, it's no well mowed, then it's ne'er be mowed by me again. I'll scatter it over the raven's den, and they'll ha' some work ere it's mowed again." A more malevolent example of a boggart is found in the simply titled story, The Boggart, taken from Thomas Keightley's The Fairy Mythology, which I found by way of Catherine Briggs' Dictionary of British Folktales. For anyone out there who listened to the Bellwitch solo episode that I did, this story might sound a little familiar. It has a bit of a similar format and some similar tropes, and it's for this reason that I've decided to retell it here. So we are told that a boggart had taken up residence in the house of a Yorkshire farmer named George Gilbertonson. Here he caused much annoyance, tormenting the farmer's children by snatching their food, shaking their curtains, and sometimes sitting on their chests at night so that they could not breathe. Now in that same house there was a particular closet, and one day the children noticed that a large knot of wood had been dug out of its backboard, leaving a hole. Whilst entertaining himself, the youngest child stuck a shoehorn into the hole, only for it to fire back out with much force and to strike him on the head. After this, the children would stick all sorts of odds and ends in the hole to amuse themselves, with the items invariably being thrown back out with some force. Despite this entertainment, the boggart would go on to prove such a pest that the farmer decided to quit the house entirely, leaving it empty for the boggart to have. However, after the family moved their last load of furniture into their new house, the boggart would turn up again immediately, and they decided to move back to the old one as, quote, "We may as well turn back again to old house as to be tormented in another that's not so convenient." And on that note, I will end my section on English fairies and hand over to you, Crofty, to talk about fairy traditions over the border in Wales.
So, thank you, Charles. I'm now going to go into some of the fairy traditions of Wales, starting with some of the oldest traditions which do have quite a bit of an impact on the overall matter of Britain, and will sound a bit familiar if you've listened to some of our older episodes, and then into a unique type of Welsh fairy which I had quite some fun reading about. Quite enjoy going back to Welsh folklore when I get the chance. So, Wales does have a long tradition of fairy belief, which is very much tied to the landscape of hills, valleys, lakes, and mines. Wales does also boast some of the earliest written references to fairy-like beings, appearing in the Mabinogion, though the Mabinogion does both precede the name of fairy, as you mentioned, Charles, and indeed precedes the name that is commonly given to fairy creatures in Welsh, the Tylwyth Teg. I did find some recordings for that pronunciation. If it's wrong, blame everybody on the internet.
Yeah, that's my disclaimer for my Ireland section as well, is I tried, okay?
Yeah, I found multiple recordings for this. They were all Tylwyth Teg. So I apologise if it's wrong. It's the best I can get. So the term Tylwyth Teg roughly translates to fair family, and it first appears in writing in the 14th century. For a term that would become associated with such a large body of folklore and tradition, the first reference is actually quite an unexpected one. A supposedly comic poem named On a Misty Walk. And I'm actually not going to try and pronounce the Middle Welsh version of that. It's probably safer. And I will say I specified supposedly comic because obviously I can only read the English translation. I assume there must be a lot of wordplay that doesn't translate well from Middle Welsh to English. So I didn't mean to insult the poem when I said that for any Middle Welsh readers who know it.
I'm sure there are hundreds listening.
I'm sure we are quite popular among Middle Welsh scholars.
I make a joke there, but it's entirely possible there are actually. Well.
I don't think we've quite annoyed all of Wales into not listening to us yet.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, see how this section turns out. Anyway, the poem was originally attributed to the 14th century poet Dafydd ap Gwilym, who is often described as the greatest Welsh poet of all time, but modern scholars now consider it to be an imitation of Dafydd's style, and the true author is unknown. The poem doesn't concern any direct encounters with fairies. It in fact just tells of a man's attempt to travel to meet a woman and being waylaid by particularly bad weather, and he spends most of the poem cursing whatever enchanter summons the mists and rain. And he refers to the flimsy enchanter long burdened by the Tylwyth Teg. The poem does also reference the subterranean realm of Annwn, the home of the Tylwyth Teg, which listeners may remember from our Wild Hunt episode. The realm of Annwn dates back to the Mabinogion, so it is plausible that Tylwyth Teg is a term that was already associated with the denizens of Annwn at that time. While on the subject of first appearances of fairy terms in Welsh folklore, I am going to briefly interrupt myself to add a bit more context to what Charles said about the term fae, because anyone with a passing familiarity with the legend of King Arthur will of course know the name Morgan Le Fay, the enchantress who played a role in setting the events of Arthur's death in motion, and who accompanied him to Avalon after he died. As many of you will know, especially if you listen to our King Arthur episode, some of the earliest written stories of Arthur are part of the Mabinogion, and so you might be expecting me to address Morgan here. In fact, Morgan first appears by name in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini in 1150, and the epithet Le Fay is not attached to her until Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, and as you mentioned, Charles, derived from the French La Fille. While there are possible origins of Morgan in the Celtic legend that I do hope to explore in her own episode one day, direct connections to fairies do appear to be Thomas Malory's invention, and so she won't be coming up in this section of the episode. To return to the Tylwyth Teg, the 19th century folklorist Wirt Sykes divided them into 5 types in his book. He named these types as the Ellylion, or Elves, the Coblynau, Fairies of the Mines, the, wish me luck with this pronunciation, the Bubacod. Yep, there's no way that's right, but then...
I'm only thinking similar figures in Irish could be Babacad, Babacod, I don't know.
Possibly. I'm judging by its BW,
yeah.
so I think that's pronounced U. but it could also very much be made up by Sykes, which we'll see in a minute.
Okay.
He described these ones as small household fairies that would be described elsewhere in Britain as brownies. The Gwragedd Annwn, which he uses to describe the most distinctively Welsh type, were female human-like fairies who lived beneath lakes and streams, and he also mentions the Gwylion, or hag-like mountain fairies. Before giving details on the different types of fairy, he first gave a description of common aspects across these types, which we do see elsewhere in fairy folklore. As well as the name Tylwyth Teg, he also named them Bendith y Mamau, or Mother's Blessing, and also mentioned names such as Tylwyth Teg yn y Coed, the fair family of the wood, and Tylwyth Teg y Mawn, which is the fair family of the mines. Such flattering names, he said, were given to them due to the belief that to name them with anything less than kind words was to invoke their anger, while flattering names would keep you in their good graces. He describes them as often being seen dancing on moonlit nights, clad in airy and flowing robes of blue, green, white, or scarlet. However, while this basic description is useful as our introduction to the Tylwyth Teg, I will be avoiding citing Sykes any further in this episode. Sir John Rhys, who is one of the biggest authorities on Welsh folklore, and wrote Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx, which I'll be referring to heavily, is very critical of Sykes' work. He states that Sykes left no means of confirming any of his sources, and he couldn't find any folklore relating to a lot of what Sykes talked about. I'm also quite sceptical of most of Sykes' work, based on just how quickly I picked up a few glaring factual errors that he describes when he talks about the fairies in detail. As he begins to describe the Ellyllon, he claims that the English word elf is derived from it, a fact which I'm sure the Norse elves would take some issue with, as Charles already talked about. Shortly after this mention of the Ellyllon, he then goes on to name Queen Mab as the ruler of the Welsh fairies, when, as we've mentioned, there is no evidence at all to suggest any folkloric origin of Queen Mab, as far as we can tell. Much like Herne the Hunter, when we talked about him in The Wild Hunt, she's an original creation of Shakespeare. I also can't find any references to the names Ellyllon or Coblynau elsewhere, except ones which cite Sykes later on, and it's quite possible that Sykes is instead attributing stories influenced by the English into older Welsh folklore. The Coblynau name in particular seems in fact to be derived from goblin, which obviously you discussed the origins of, Charles, earlier on, so doesn't seem to be an original Welsh word. Fairies that fit the description of Coblynau, smaller fairies of the mines, do crop up in occasional folk tales here and there, but I'm not really going to be able to go into detail on them today, just because it is quite scattered references and I was a bit limited for time. There's a lot else to cover, I'm afraid. The only term for an individual type of fairy that Sykes mentions that I can find a reference to is Gwragedd Annwn, obviously because it references the realm of Annwn, and the fairies that this term describes are the kind that we most commonly see in the Welsh sources. Before I go to these particular types of fairies though, these unique Welsh kinds, I will go back to the beginning, to the Mabinogion. So, several tales in the Mabinogion have aspects that do appear to be precursors of the fairy legend. The otherworld realm of Annwn, that I have mentioned, is very prominent in the first branch of the Mabinogion. Previously in our Wild Hunt episode, we discussed Annwn as the realm ruled by Gwyn ap Nudd. We discussed his hunting hounds, the Cwn Annwn, and how Gwyn and his hounds would take the souls of the dead and lead them to the afterlife. The description that we gave in Wild Hunt, and that is associated with Gwyn, is somewhat hellish. However, this description isn't what we see in the first branch of the Mabinogion. Instead, Annwn is an otherworld with many dangerous creatures, but is also a land of plenty. And King Pwyll, of the Welsh kingdom of Dyfed, befriends Arawn, the king of Annwn, in this branch of the Mabinogion. This friendship led to prosperity for the realm of Dyfed in the form of trade between King Pool and King Aran, and Aran bestowing the rich gift of a large herd of pigs on Pool's son, Prince Pryderi, for his wedding. As the story goes, such animals were not seen in Wales prior to this gift, and their meat was described as a much sweeter food than oxen. These gifts of wondrous livestock of Annwn would be a very prominent feature in later stories of the Tylwyth Teg. Aran himself is a powerful enchanter who later leads an army of otherworldly creatures alongside Pryderi in his war against the kingdom of Gwynedd. Annwn is also prominent in a later Welsh poem from the Book of Taliesin, a poem called Prydau Annwn, or The Spoils of Annwn. In this poem, King Arthur and his knights travel there, where it is again a prosperous land compared to other worlds from Irish mythology, and in it Arthur steals a cauldron that would only cook meat for a courageous man, again linking Annwn with prosperity in the form of food.
Yeah, a mystical cauldron is quite a common theme in various surviving Celtic traditions.
Yes. The darker aspects of Annwn is something I'll not go into detail about here, because we have already discussed it much more in Wild Hunt. Similarly, I'll not go into when Gwyn ap Nudd took on the mantle of ruler of Annwn, where translations of the Mabinogion state he would rule over the brood of devils in Annwn, as we describe these creatures in Wild Hunt. And while they are sometimes associated with the Tylwyth Teg, because they're more often described as hellhounds, then they don't really fit with the scope of this episode. Gwyn is another figure I'd like to at least dedicate a mini-episode to, but for today, we will leave him and move on to the stories that are now most commonly associated with Welsh fairies. And this uniquely Welsh type of fairy is probably my favourite thing that I intend to describe this episode, because I am a gigantic nerd, and they are a very obvious precursor to the fairies of a favourite piece of media that I mentioned earlier, The Legend of Zelda. Because of that, I'd like to retell one of the most prominent stories of these fairies in full, which I took from Sir John Rhys's Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx. And this story is that of the fairy of Llyn y Fan Fach. The legend, according to Rhys, dates from the 12th century, specifying that the protagonist lived when the eventful struggle made by the princes of South Wales to preserve their independence was drawing to a close, which places it sometime around the year 1160. This story goes that at this time there lived a widow in Carmarthenshire who had one son and a large amount of livestock left to her by her late husband. Her livestock would graze on Mynyd Du, or Black Mountain, overlooking the lake Llyn y Fan Fach, which translates as Little Lake by the Peak, and her grown son was tasked with watching these herds. One day, he saw the most beautiful lady he had ever seen out on the water. He rushed down to the lake shore, hoping to meet her, and he tried to offer to share his bread with her. She glided across the lake to him, but took one look at the bread and said, "Hard baked is thy bread, 'tis not so easy to catch me," and she disappeared under the lake. He returned home, and he asked his mother what he should do to win her over. She said, because the woman rejected the hard-baked bread, that he should take the unbaked dough to her instead. Next day, he waited around the lake for a long time, and eventually she reappeared and he offered her the dough. This time, she said, "Unbaked is thy bread, I will not have thee," and she disappeared again. The following day, he tried a third time, this time taking partly baked bread, and when she appeared, she accepted it. He, being madly in love with her beauty, asked her to marry him. She disappeared under the lake without answering. He stayed, heartbroken, but unwilling to leave the lake. A man then rose from the lake, flanked by two identical women who looked just like the mysterious woman that the young man had met, and followed by large herds of cows, sheep, and goats. The man said that he was the woman's father, and that he would consent to the young man marrying his daughter on one condition, that he could identify which of his two daughters he had met. The young man looked over the two for a long time, looking for any difference that might give it away. He had nearly given up until one of the women moved her foot slightly, and he spotted a difference in how she had tied her sandals, which he recognised from seeing her before, and so he chose her. Her father said that he had chosen correctly, and as a dowry he would give her the herds of several hundred cows, sheep, goats, and horses. However, if the young man were to strike his wife 3 times without cause, she and all of the livestock would return to the lake. So the two married and lived on a farm outside the village, and she bore him 3 sons. The two lived happily for many years. One day, there was a christening in the village. The wife was very reluctant to go because of the distance to walk, and the husband said that they had many fine horses that she could ride, so she could ride to the village instead. She agreed, and she asked her husband to fetch her riding gloves. When he returned with them, he playfully slapped her shoulder with one of the gloves, urging her to get ready, and she reminded him that he was not to strike her without cause, and that this was the first strike. Sometime later, they attended a wedding, and while everyone else was making merry, she burst into tears. He touched her on the shoulder and asked her what was wrong, and she told him, "Now people are entering into trouble, and your troubles are likely to commence, as you have the second time stricken me without a cause." Many years later, when all 3 of their children were grown, they were attending a funeral, and the wife was in very high spirits. He touched her on the shoulder and said, "Hush, don't laugh at a time like this." And she said, "The last blow has been struck, our marriage contract is at an end, farewell." She walked out of the house, walked through the fields, calling to each of the hundreds of animals by name as she went, and all of them, even the cows that had recently been slaughtered, got up and followed her more than 6 miles to the lake. One horse even dragged a plough with it, and possibly the ploughman, it's not said, dragging them to the lake and leaving a long furrow in the earth, which still remains to this day.
Yes, that's another example of the fairy lover motif that ends with the fairy returning to her people.
Yes, and this becomes very common in Wales. There are a few other variants that I will be discussing. The fate of the man was never recorded, and in older versions, this is the end of the story. John Rhys, however, goes on to tell of what came of their sons, as the sons would visit the lake regularly for a long time in the hopes of seeing their mother again. One day, the eldest son, Rhiwallon, I apologise for that pronunciation, I have no idea, I cannot find anything for it. The eldest son met her at a place in the mountain trail leading to the lake called Llhiriad-y Meddygon, or the Physician's Gate. She told him that his purpose on earth was as a benefactor to humanity, to relieve them from pain and misery, and heal all manner of diseases. For this, she gave him a bag full of medical supplies and equipment, and taught him thoroughly in the arts of medicine. She told him to teach that knowledge to his brothers and to all their sons, and they would become, for generations, the most skillful doctors in the country. She would meet them many more times over the years on the shores of the lake to advise them. Rhiwallon, let's try it that way, would become... I feel you've got to pronounce the R's that way.
Yeah, I'm going by the fact that the latest historical figure of Cadwallon, I think his name is. It sounds a bit similar to that, so I think you're on the right tracks, but obviously I know basically nothing. I have no expertise here. Why am I even talking?
Yeah, sorry, Wales. The eldest son would become the chief physician to the Lord of Llandovery, and he and his brothers would be given land at the village of Mythfi. The descendants would become known as the Physicians of Mythfi, the most famous physicians in Wales. The last known practicing physician of this family was John Jones, who was buried in Mythfi in 1739, and the connection to this family was recorded on his gravestone, though physicians as far away as Aberystwyth on the west coast were still claiming descent from this family until at least 1845. As I mentioned, this fairy has had some quite notable effects on popular culture. I mentioned the great fairies of the Legend of Zelda, who would often emerge from a pool, would give an item or money, or improved health, or magic or items. I don't know if there was a specific story that inspired Shigeru Miyamoto to create these fairies, but the Welsh legends of lake fairies are the earliest source of any kind of fairy that would emerge from under the water and confer gifts. And they are the only kind, from what I can find, the only kind of water-related fairies that are completely humanoid. Others, such as mermaids, obviously have fish-like aspects, or selkies or kelpies, which would turn into seals when they contact the water. Another famous example of this type of fairy, that will still be well known to modern listeners, would of course be a strange woman lying in a pond distributing swords, King Arthur's Lady of the Lake.
Which is no basis for reasonable government.
Exactly. And so we'll not go into her further. Well, she does slightly come up in a minute, actually. A colleague of Sir John, wish me luck on this pronunciation, Llywarch Reynolds, Llywarch, of Merthyr Tydfil in Breconshire, would later write to Sir John as he was working on his study of Welsh folklore, telling of a discovery of what he called a sequel to the Physicians of Mythfi, which, contrary to Rhys's version, did describe the fate of the fairy woman's husband. Rhys is less certain of this connection than Reynolds was, and he instead suggests that it is a separate legend that would mistakenly get attached to his earlier story, and gives a good reason why. According to Reynolds, the legend states that the husband, distraught over the loss of his wife, gathered his friends and set to work attempting to drain the lake to get to her realm and to reclaim her. They made a great cutting into the lake bank, but when they did so, a huge hairy monster emerged from the water and threatened that if they continued, it would drown the town of Brecon. Now, if you're at all familiar with Welsh geography, you will know that Black Mountain is at the western end of Blanau Brycheiniog, formerly known in English as the Brecon Beacons. The Welsh government officially restored their Welsh name last year, and I'm not going to be dead naming mountains on this show. The town of Brecon is in the northeast part of the range, about as far as you can get while still being in the region from Llyn Fan Fac and Black Mountain. And so the threat to drown Brecon makes no sense if it occurred at Llyn Fan Fac. Rhys instead believes that this is a distortion of a legend surrounding Llyn Cwm Lake, or Llyn Cwm Lake, a smaller lake beneath the peaks of Pen y Fan and Corn Du, which are the highest peaks in South Wales and are quite close to the town of Brecon, and which I have a few nice photos of for the video version.
Ooh. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the island section because it involves a bunch of sites that we went to and filmed at, so that's going to be fun.
Ah, nice. Going to enjoy that then. So, according to this legend, there was once a rock in the middle of this lake in which there was a doorway. Once per year, on May Day, the door would open and one could enter the Garden of the Fairies, which Rhys describes as an exquisite paradise. This rock was only visible as an indistinct mass from the shore of the lake. One visitor who had made it to the Garden of the Fairies attempted to take some flowers given to him by the fairies back to the human world, and he was punished with the loss of his senses, and the door was locked ever since that day. However, knowing of the entrance to the Garden of the Fairies, a man would later attempt to gain access by digging a gully to drain the water away. According to one version, a similar monster to what Reynolds described appeared, making the same threat to drown the town of Brecon. Another colleague of Rhys, Ivor James from the University of Wales, states that there are two alternative versions. One where a man in an armchair wearing a red coat appeared on the surface, and another that the spectre of an old woman appeared, each making the same threat. The old woman may be a fairy, or may even be the Lady of the Lake, while a man clothed in red is thought to be a soldier from the days when Welsh soldiers wore red cloaks. Rhys cites a 16th century description of the region, where he says that one of the mountains overlooking the lake, Bannock Denny, was also known at the time as Ban Arthur. While Rhys doesn't directly state any connection between the lake and Arthurian legend, it is possible that that means the fairy garden here was thought by some to be Avalon, and so the protector was Arthur himself or the Lady of the Lake, depending on the version. Similar stories to Llyn Fan Fac do appear at other lakes in Wales. Rhys cites a shorter story surrounding Llyn Forwyn, the damsel's pool in Glamorganshire in South Wales. It keeps most of the elements of a farmer spotting a woman on the lake, making multiple attempts to court her, and her bringing large herds of livestock with her and bestowing prosperity on him. However, her condition is that if they quarrel 3 times, she and her livestock will return to the lake, and sure enough, after years of marriage, he breaks this condition and loses both wife and livestock. These stories pop up around a great number of lakes in Wales and illustrate the general view of the Tylwyth Teg, that they could bring great prosperity to those who won their favour, that the world of the fairies and the lake was a rich one, but that any slight would turn them against you, and one had to watch even the smallest, most seemingly inconsequential actions for fear of bringing their anger. So, there are 2 main variants of the conditions that a husband must not break if he marries a fairy wife. One, as I've just described, relies on striking or quarrelling with the fairy, and this condition must always be broken 3 times for the fairy to leave. As we saw in the story, strike is often interpreted as any touch without consent, and so it is possible to interpret these stories as warnings on respecting your wife's boundaries. In these versions, when the wife returns to the lake, she always physically walks to the lake, and the livestock always follows her. So you actually see her leave in the stories. Whereas the other version relates to a common superstition about fairies that we've discussed, that they cannot abide the touch of iron.
There we go.
There we go. Told you it was coming. In these versions, if iron touches the fairy even once, she vanishes immediately without a trace, as does anything that she brought with her. So there are stories where this will happen in an accident, such as a riding crop with iron in the handle accidentally dropping and hitting her while they're riding together, things like that. It's basically never intentional in these variants, and so fits more with the superstitious idea rather than a warning of how to behave. When not associated with lakes, these fairies would instead be seen in stone rings, or, like you discussed in England, rings of mushrooms or flowers. And some stories would have the man marrying the fairy after joining their dancers in these rings. Alternatively, there are some fairies associated with mountain caves, and they will be found by following the sound of their singing. But invariably, these stories would have a man marrying a fairy woman who would bring him prosperity until the condition of their marriage is broken, and then she is gone. And so, I think that draws my section on Wales to a close. And with that, I think it's time to leave Wales and head over to Ireland, I believe.
Thank you, Crofty. So, within the boundaries of Irish folklore, the major group that has been broadly associated with fairies are what are known as the Eshi, which share many of their attributes. These figures are also known under a range of other names, such as the good people, the good neighbours, the fair folk, or even the folk of the mounds. Now, these figures are often said to have something of an origin story. So we have discussed briefly where some of the origins of various fairy terms came from. We didn't really have much on the way of explaining where the creatures themselves were created beyond just vague, Christian concepts of, these are fallen angels or risen dead or unbaptized spirits and that sort of thing. By comparison, in many traditions, the Eshi are connected with wider Irish mythology, and that is because they are often said to be the descendants, or alternatively diminished versions, of a group known as the Tuatha De Danann. So, for anyone unfamiliar with Irish mythology, the Tuatha Dé Danann are a race of long-lived supernatural figures who are said to have ruled Ireland in the distant past. Within the body of text known as the mythological cycle, they are described variably as being demons, or occasionally just as long-lived men, and as being able to summon monsters and giants to aid their cause. It is, however, agreed by most modern scholars that some of these creatures were in fact pre-Christian gods associated with Ireland's major prehistoric centres, and that these figures were later reinserted into Irish myth in kind of a euhemerised fashion by the Christian monks who compiled most of the texts of Irish mythology. A similar example of this can be found in how the Norse gods were presented as mortal kings and heroes in the various texts of the Heimskringla of Norse mythology. Now, the most important text we have that chronicles these figures is what is known as the Leivor Gavala Éireann, or in some versions I've heard it pronounced Leia instead of Leivor. I don't really know the intricacies of Old Irish, so I'm going to go with Leivor Gavala Éireann. This is also known as the Book of the Takings of Ireland, and it is a collection of poems and prose texts that was written down in several different versions between the 12th and the 14th century. Today, the most important surviving copies of this document are found in works such as the Book of Leinster, the Book of Ballymote, and the Great Book of Lecan, whilst the version also exists in the 17th century Annals of the Four Masters that seems to be using some material that does not seem to be extant from other sources. Interestingly, a version of this text also appears in an early 9th century Welsh work called the Historia Brittonum, that has traditionally been attributed to a monk named Nennius, though according to modern scholars, this attribution, which comes from like a preface on later editions of the work, is actually thought to be a forgery. Interestingly, the Danann themselves don't appear in this version at all, so it is possible that they had yet to be incorporated into the story at this date, or that the version in the Historia Brittonum is somewhat garbled. To the best of my knowledge, a version of the story also appears in the work of Geraldus of Wales. So, the Leivor Gavala Éireann outlines a series of invasions of Ireland by 6 successive groups of people that stretch back into biblical times, beginning with the arrival of Caesar and her followers shortly before the arrival of the biblical flood. The Tuatha Dé Danann were the second to last of these groups, who are said to have seized most of Ireland from a people known as the Fir Bolg after defeating them at the First Battle of Mythillogical. Later, the Danann would themselves fall under the impression of a monstrous group known as the Fomorians through the rule of their second king Brice, who is said to have been conceived from the union of King Elfa of the Fomorians and Eriu of the Tuatha Dé Danann. This oppression eventually came to a head at the Second Battle of Mythillogical. Here the Tuatha Dé Danann triumphed over their enemies and expelled them from Ireland, then went on to rule over this nation until they were eventually defeated themselves by the claimed ancestors of the modern Irish, the Milesians or the Gaels. Now, a lot of scholars that I have read on the subject claim that the Leivor Gavala Éireann goes on to say that after this, the two forces agreed to partition Ireland between them, with the Gaels taking all of Ireland that existed above the ground, and the Danann taking either all that lay below the ground, or alternatively the various Irish otherworlds. However, on reading through RMS McAllister's translation, which includes various different versions of the text, I can't actually find any section that says this directly, just that the Tuatha Dé Danann ended up maintaining their own kings after they were defeated in order to avoid being fully dominated. I'm aware that McAllister's version is apparently quite criticised by modern scholars, so there may be something else going on there that I'm unaware of. Despite all I've said there, though, it generally seems to be agreed by scholars, and also can be confirmed for their appearances elsewhere in Irish myth, that these figures came to reside in the various Irish otherworlds, which includes Chirnanog, Chirnael, Mag Mel, and Aun Ablak. It is in this later incarnation as the immortal rulers of the otherworlds that these figures are most seen to resemble some of the earliest English traditions of elves and later fairies. This often takes the form of mortals trespassing into their realms through one of several methods. Common examples of this include entering a sudden mist, going under the surface of the sea or lakes, or by entering a fairy mound, which is also known as a she. So the she is a name that is given to a wide variety of different prehistoric structures, including Neolithic passage tombs and Bronze Age barrows, along with a number of natural caves and hills. Some of the most notable of these she are the Great Passage tombs at the Brunnerboyne complex, the Mound of the Hostages at Tara, which you'll remember as that passage tomb that we saw when we went and visited the site, Crofty.
I do remember that one, yeah. Nice place.
Yeah, and also the she at Raf Crocan or Raf Cruachan. I think Raf Cruachan or Raf Crocan is correct. The site manager that we spoke to on the day, I think he said Raf Crocan from what I remember.
Yeah, I remember Raf Crocan.
Yeah, that was Dr. Daniel Curley, I believe, and thank you to him for letting us do some filming there when we were filming for that Irish Druids video on the History channel. But if we've got that wrong, I'm not laying the blame at his feet. That's just what I remember. The version that I saw online everywhere was Raf Cruachan rather than Raf Crocan. Interestingly, one theory is that the she at Raf Crocan is actually a structure known today as the Owenagat, or the Cave of the Cats. So, Crofty, you will probably remember that as the cave that we squeezed inside with all that lighting equipment and stuff to try and film in there. That was really wet and muddy because we made the mistake of visiting the site in November.
Yeah. I also remember the cat that led us to it and sat guard while we were there.
Yeah, I managed to get it on camera as well. That's
yeah,
I
got a couple of pictures.
So, to get us back on topic, usually these she are said to be portals to the otherworld that stand open on significant dates, such as the Celtic festivals of Samhain and La Bealtaine. In some folkloric stories, they also stand open at night, and it is for this reason that in superstitions they are best avoided after sundown. So the best example I found of mortals just accidentally stumbling into the otherworld and encountering a member of the Tuatha Dé Danann involves the god Lugh. Within Irish mythology, Lugh was known for his prowess at many different crafts, for which he was given the title of the Many-Skilled, and he was also known for his great skill with the javelin and the sling, which led to his second title of the Long-Armed. He is considered to be one of the major candidates for the head of the Irish pantheon, alongside the figure of the Dagda, and it is argued that he may have been an Irish equivalent of the ancient god Lugus, who is represented in inscriptions and possible iconography throughout Britain, Gaul, and Iberia. I haven't really written anything down on this, but it is also thought that in Julius Caesar's commentary on the Gallic Wars, the figure of Mercury that he mentions as the head of their pantheon may in fact also be this figure. It's just one theory based on that god being described as a god of crafts. Within the more euhemerized traditions of the mythological cycles, he is said to have been adopted into the Danann, despite being half Fomorian himself, and after playing a pivotal role in defeating the Fomorians in the Second Battle of Mythillogical, he is in fact crowned their king. After ruling for 40 years, he is eventually killed by his enemies, and is buried at the ritual site of Ishnoch. However, death clearly wasn't that big an inconvenience to him, as he repeatedly shows up throughout later parts of the Irish cycles. The main example of this I have comes from the tale of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Balia in Scale, or the Phantom's Frenzy. So in this tale, King Con of the 100 Battles is at the royal rampart of Tara, accompanied by 3 druids and 3 fili, or poets/prophets. That's generally what their role is in Irish mythology. There he chanced upon a stone that when he trod upon, it cried out so it was heard for a wide distance around. After consulting with one of his druids, he is eventually told that the name of the stone is Fal, as in the Lear Fal, which Crofty you will remember as that great fowl-shaped stone that's in the centre of the Figure of 8 complex at the top of the hill.
Oh yeah, that one.
Yeah, the one that we managed to get a crow landing on top of whilst talking about the Morrigan, so that was fun.
Yes, that was a perfect picture.
Yeah. In addition, he is told that the number of cries that this stone uttered when he trod on it corresponds to the number of kings that will reign between Con and the Day of Judgment. After this, they suddenly see a great mist around them and become thoroughly lost. However, they soon hear the sound of a horseman approaching, who rides up and casts his spear at them 3 times. He then ceases his attack and bids Con welcome. He invites the group into his dwelling, and when they go inside, they find themselves on a plain marked by a golden tree, beneath which they see a splendid house. Upon entering, they see a young woman seated on a throne and wearing a golden crown, before who is set a golden cup and dipper, along with a vast silver vat filled with ale. The horseman from before then appears before them, seated upon a great throne, and it is said of him that there was never in Tara a man of his size or beauty. He says to them, "I am not a phantom nor a spectre. I have come on account of my fame among you since my death, and I am of the race of Adam. My name is Lu, son of Aethliu, son of Tigernmas. This is why I have come, to relate to you the length of your reign, and of every reign there will be in Tara." It is then revealed to the men that the woman before the group is the sovereignty goddess of Ireland. She serves Con with his meal, which is a rib of a boar and the rib of a cow some 24 feet long, then distributes drinks on Lu's command. Finally, she names every ruler between Con and the Day of Judgment, on which point the men go into, quote, the phantom shadow, and the house and the plain disappear, leaving Con holding the golden cup and the dipper. So what's kind of interesting about that story to me, Crofty, is that we actually went to Ishnok to film some more footage for that video I mentioned. That was the place we went to where it was really horribly misty on the day.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and we were supposed to get some drone shots of Lu's purported cairn there, but we weren't allowed to get too close due to like the landowner's permissions being worded a specific way, and it was too foggy to see anything, so I ended up buying some drone footage instead. However, the fact that we weren't able to get close enough to the cairn to film might actually have been a good thing, given that's exactly how Con and his followers ended up meeting Lu, just wandering around in a mist.
And also gave us some very good atmospheric shots of the mist on the fields.
Indeed. By the way, if anyone listening is interested in some further examples of this type of story, you can also check out the stories of Conla in the Otherworld and Cormac Macert in the Otherworld, which feature mortals stumbling into the realms of Magmel and, I'll try and pronounce this one correctly, Chirtengir, where they encounter a supernatural woman alongside Manannán mac Lir. I've also heard that said as Manannán mac Lir, who is the Irish god of the sea. There also exists the tale of the adventures of Nera, which involves a man entering the Shee at Rathcruachan and meeting an unnamed fairy king and queen. And that story actually ends with the Shee there being destroyed by Queen Maeve and her husband. So that's another little fun tidbit from Irish mythology. So to move us along, despite the reported links between the Shee and the Tuatha Dé Danann, we should note that the Danann themselves very rarely, if ever, appear in later Irish folklore, and as such, the most charitable interpretation I feel comfortable with giving is that they can be thought of as a kind of distant group of ancestors, or as a group from which the modern good folk evolved from. Though how exactly that occurred is of course uncertain. The figures, as we understand them, of the Danann are also kind of obscured by being euhemerized in these tales written down by Christian monks. So it's a bit of a mess, basically. Now, with regards to more modern Irish folklore on the Shee, as I mentioned before, most of the pioneering work in this regard was done by antiquarians and folklorists between the early 19th and early 20th century, and that would later be continued by various archival collections who recorded a large body of oral tales from the 1920s through to the 1980s, particularly in the case of the Irish Folklore Commission, which I think ran from 1935 to 1970. So a lot of the information I'm going to be giving here today comes from 3 major collections of Irish folklore. These are the books Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland by the antiquarian Thomas Crofton Crocker, Lady Gregory's Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland, and the works Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry and Irish Fairy Tales by William Butler Yeats. As common amongst early folklorists, these authors are extremely liberal with what they have categorized as a fairy. So what I've done today is I've kind of teased out of this a few of the more obviously fairy-like beings of Ireland for us to talk about today. So similar to the English fairies, within these figures there have been historically 2 major divisions. These are the trooping fairies, or the Sheffro, and these tend to fall very close to the little dancing fairies archetype that we discussed before, and then there is also the more solitary fairies. It is this latter group that contains some of what I'd like to term the rock star fairies of Irish legend, that are famous enough that some of our more international listeners are probably well aware of them. Before I talk about those more famous fairies, I'd like to briefly examine some of the archetypes associated with the trooping fairies. Generally, the examples I found of these within Irish folklore are quite similar to the generic dancing fairies that I spoke about before in my England section, so I won't go too much into that. A few interesting little traits that they have is that this group consists of various spirits who are said to dwell either underground or in the Irish otherworld of Churnanog. Like the pixies, they're often associated with what are known as fairy forts or mounds, which is a kind of a general term for a wide variety of different prehistoric structures. In Ireland, this includes structures dating back as far as the Neolithic, such as dolmens, menhirs, and stone circles, along with the previously mentioned Sidhe, and other structures such as Bronze Age hill forts and early medieval ring forts. They are also connected to fairy circles, and sometimes to fairy trees, particularly hawthorns, so you may not remember, Crofty, when we arrived at Ishnock, we were shown a fairy tree there as well.
I'd forgotten about that, actually.
Yeah, I think it's because I went off to film that is why, whilst you guys went down and saw the big goddess statue that was much more eye-catching.
Yeah, that and it's been 2 years.
Yeah, that's fair as well. And we were all, I think, quite sleep-deprived as well.
A little bit.
As with other fairy traditions, these figures are also often presented as diminutive and as being associated with the colours red and green. According to Catherine Briggs, in some tales their diminutive stature is due to the slow dwindling of their power, which will eventually result in them disappearing entirely. In terms of temperament, these figures can be quite capricious, but a common rule is that they will treat mortals well if they are themselves treated with courtesy or are placated with some sort of offering. So to demonstrate this, I have selected the story The Fairies' Dancing Place from William Butler Yeats' Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland. So in this tale, we are told that a man named Lantiny McCluskey married a woman and needed a house in which to, quote, keep her, because, societal attitudes towards women in the 19th century, unfortunately. Anyway, Lantry had 6 acres of farmland, but no house, so he decided to build it in the most comfortable place possible. He selected as a site a beautiful green circle that supposedly was the playground of fairies, despite being warned not to do so by his neighbours. The building, however, went nicely, and on finishing the house, he carried out the local tradition of throwing his friends and neighbours a housewarming party. This gathering seemed to be going well, until then night fell. After this point, all present heard a strange noise, as if something were crushing and straining the ribs and the rafters of the house. Quote, as if 1,000 little men were engaged in pulling down the roof. A commanding voice then said, come work hard, you know we must have Lantry's house down before midnight. Lantry, being understandably unhappy about this, walked out and addressed them, saying, gentlemen, I humbly ask your pardon for building on any place belonging to you, but if you'll have the civilitude to let me alone this night, I'll begin to pull down and remove the house tomorrow morning. In response, all present heard a sound like 1,000 little hands clapping, followed by a shout of, bravo, Lantry! Build halfway between the 2 white thorns above the boreen. After a final whoop, the party heard nothing more from the fairies that night. Lantry proceeded to do as he'd promised, and whilst digging the foundation of his new house, he came across a large vessel filled with gold. Thus, in daring to build his first house where he did, he became a richer man than he ever might had he not encountered the fairies at all. So I'm now going to move on and discuss the solitary fairies. I've selected a few famous figures that stood out to me. And the first one of these is a figure that stands pretty much head and shoulders above all others when it comes to its presence within the popular culture of Ireland. It could in fact be said to be something of a national icon of that country, for better or worse. And I'm of course referring to the leprechaun. So I'm pretty certain that almost everyone listening will be familiar with the stereotypical appearance of the leprechaun in pop culture, that being a short man with red hair and beard, dressed in a green outfit and hat, usually with a buckle on it. This figure is also often associated with 4-leaf clovers, and is said to have knowledge of a pot of gold located at the end of a rainbow, which he may or may not give up if he is caught. In Irish folklore, however, the leprechaun is quite different. He's really more of a wizened figure. Like many of the solitary fairies in Irish traditions, they are more associated with the colour red than green, though the details of this are a little contradictory between individual stories, and I'll get into that briefly later on. From the descriptions provided of these creatures by 19th century folklorists, and also looking at some of the illustrations from the time, I think it's fair to say that they envisioned the leprechaun more as an elderly, gnomish type of creature. So, for example, in Dr. R. McAnally's 1888 work, Irish Wonders, they are described as the children of evil spirits and degenerate fairies, who are about 3 feet in height, who wear red clothing that was in style last over a century ago, so that would be like 18th century, going by when this was written down, which is often decorated by an Elizabethan style ruff and lace. Lady Gregory similarly describes them as being very small, roughly knee height, whilst William Butler Yeats describes the leprechaun as old, withered, and solitary. This inconsistent height, by the way, is something of a feature of leprechaun tales, and according to John J. Winberry in the article The Elusive Elf, Some Thoughts on the Nature and Origin of the Irish Leprechaun, depending on the specific story, they are often seen to stand anywhere from between 1.5 inches to 2 feet tall. So, in Irish folk tales, leprechauns most often appear in the guise of fairy shoemakers, who are to be found working beneath hedgerows, and whose presence is usually given away by the tink-tink sound of their hammer. Similar to brownies, they are known to be very industrious, though usually their labour is for their own benefit, and they are sometimes said to have become very wealthy through their profession. As in later pop culture, the folkloric leprechaun is also said to be in possession of some form of a pot of gold, or to have a more general knowledge of the hidden treasures of Ireland. In various leprechaun tales, mortals are also seen to be able to acquire it by capturing the creature, though unlike the more pop culture view, this is in fact only the beginning of the process when it comes to claiming this treasure. And that's because in most of these tales, leprechauns usually manage to trick their captors into releasing them, either through their actions or words, and it is exceptionally rare that they ever have to give up their gold. So, a good example of this is in the poem The Leprechaun by William Ailingham, which I got by way of Catherine Briggs' dictionary, in which a leprechaun is able to waylay his captor by casually taking out his snuff box and blowing the contents in the protagonist's unsuspecting face. There is also another story that is cited by Catherine Briggs that does involve the rare instance of someone getting one over on a leprechaun. I decided to go into this story in particular because it does actually involve a leprechaun whose physical appearance is at least somewhat more similar to that of our more modern idea of what this creature should look like. This story comes from Lady Gregory's Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms and Superstitions of Ireland, and is simply titled The Leprechaun. So this story is presented as a legend about a family who are said to live near Castle Rare, who are rumoured to have come into their wealth through the actions of a friendly leprechaun. So in this story, there was once a poor boy, said to be one of the family's forefathers, who lived a hard existence and survived by selling turf from his cart. He was known to be a very silent boy by others. He never joined in with any sports, instead spending a lot of his time reading old bits of books that he came across, and some folk even claimed that he was a fairy changeling himself. All he longed for in the world was to become rich, and to live in a beautiful house with nothing but books around him. In one of his books, he had read of how leprechauns knew of all the secret places where gold lay hid, and so he set out to find one. One evening, he heard the clink-clink of the leprechaun's hammer, and followed it until he found a little man clothed in green, so more in line with the more modern idea of a leprechaun, who was also wearing a cocked hat, who was busy fixing shoes under a hedge. The boy seized the leprechaun by the neck, telling him, "Now you don't stir from this till you tell me where to find the hidden gold. The leprechaun begs the boy not to hurt him and says that he will help him, as he and the boy are actually cousins once removed, so somewhat confirming the idea that the boy was in fact a changeling. He then says that he will show the boy a place of secret gold that none can have nor keep except those of fairy blood and race, if only the lad will take him to the old fort of Lippenshaw, and that they must make haste, as when the last red glow of the sun vanishes, so too will the treasure. So the boy hoists the little man onto his cart and races off to Lippenshaw. Here they come across a door in a stone wall, and inside they find ground covered with gold and silver vessels. The boy gathers up all that he can carry and takes them to his cart, but when he tries to return and take more, the door shuts with a clap and the leprechaun disappears for good. The boy laments that he has no way of thanking the leprechaun and decides to tell no one of what had transpired. Instead, he takes the money off to the bank, where he finds himself to be as rich as a lord and able to buy the house and library of his dreams. As a final note on the wealth of a leprechaun, these creatures are also sometimes said to be in possession of a magic purse, which they keep tucked into their coat. Inside this purse is always to be found a shilling, which will miraculously replace itself no matter how many times it is spent. Again, according to John J. Winberry, leprechauns may in fact have had something of an ancestor in earlier Irish texts. These are a group of figures known as the Leucorpans or the Leprechauns, so very similar etymology there. Examples of these figures can be found in a poem dating from the mid-8th century, which is contained in an early legal text known as the Senachus Mar. In this poem, a king by the name of Fergus is seen to be carried into the sea by 3 Leucorpans. Upon touching the water, however, he awakens and seizes the tiny figures, demanding wishes from them in return for their lives. So John J. Winberry kind of draws a comparison between these wishes and the later practice of the pot of gold. Similarly, a 13th or 14th century account, known as the Death of Fergus, which may be based on much older material, as a lot of early Irish texts are, features a leprechaun king and his court, who is said to be in possession of a magical cauldron, along with a pair of shoes that allow him to walk on water. In both of these tales, these figures are described as diminutive, so quite similar to leprechauns, but when you get into the real details of their actual appearance and behaviour, they do in fact seem quite distinct. Instead of being old and wizened, as various 19th century antiquarians would describe the leprechaun, they are described instead as being dressed in silk shirts, gold-embroidered tunics, and scarlet cloaks, and as being very comely to look at. They are also described as living in a far-off land across a wide sea, where their cattle and horses are equally tiny, and where they spend their time feasting and hunting. In addition to these possible ancestral figures, there also exists a few modern regional variants of the leprechaun, or at least creatures that have been lumped in alongside it. These include the Cluricaun of County Cork, the Luricaun of Kerry, and the Loggerry man of Ulster. I couldn't find a pronunciation for that last one, so apologies if I got that one wrong. These figures have been treated in different ways by early antiquarians. So, for example, Thomas Crofton Crocker largely considered them to be regional variants on the same figure, whilst Douglas Hyde considered the names Leprechaun, Cluricaun, and the Fur Darrig, which is another figure, to represent different aspects of a single type of fairy. So to kind of round off my section on leprechauns, I just want to go into these last two figures and look at some of their more individualistic traditions. So starting with the Cluricaun, according to Patricia Monaghan, unlike the more industrious leprechaun, the Cluricaun is said to be a lazy creature who spends much of his time lounging around smoking, drinking, and primping his handsome clothing. This includes a red suit, a set of silver buckled shoes, and a golden lace cap. Instead of working, it is this fairy's wont to sneak into wine cellars, particularly those that belong to alcoholics, where he would often steal a few bottles and get drunk. Unfortunately, once a Cluricaun has taken up residence, It was said to be very difficult to remove, and similar to the Bogart story I told earlier, they're also said to have a habit of moving alongside families. One of the methods they were said to do this was by concealing themselves inside a barrel of wine. Again, according to Patricia Monaghan, a cluricaun was also said to scare servants if they themselves attempted to steal wine, thus rendering the owner something of a service. And indeed, there is kind of a whole separate tradition of the cluricaun also acting more like a brownie, which I'm not really going to get into today because we've spoken about that creature plenty so far. By comparison, the third Darrig is a simpler, less defined figure. I couldn't find anywhere near as much information about it, but according to Thomas Crofton Crocker, these figures appeared to be wizened old men of around 2.5 feet tall, who wear a red coat and hat, and who busy themselves with practical jokes of an often gruesome nature. Often these creatures frame their antics as punishments for a mortal failing to honour a request with them. So Catherine Briggs gives a couple of examples. The first is an example of a man who is unable to produce a story for the third Darrig on its request, who then goes on to be tormented by a series of illusions. And she also mentions that anyone who fails to give hospitality to the third Darrig around a campfire is going to suffer ill luck in the future. So I think that's a pretty good overview of the leprechaun and its variants. So I'm now going to move on to the next solitary fairy which I have selected, which is the merrow. So the merrow are usually considered to be Irish versions of the wider folkloric figure of the mermaid. I do expect that we will end up doing a full episode on mermaids at some point, but that's a big enough topic where I don't think we're going to lose too much by discussing the merrow here. So, according to a Masters of Philosophy thesis I used titled The Motif of the Mermaid in English, Irish and Scottish Fairy and Folk Tales by Stephanie Kicking-Gereda, within Irish folklore, the merrow is seen to have two distinctive forms. The first of these is pretty typical of wider mermaid archetypes, being described as a beautiful woman with long hair, pale skin and dark eyes, whose lower half ends in a tail similar to a fish. This version of the figure is also known to be a shapeshifter and is capable of appearing both as a fairy and as a human female. The second variant is as a male or female figure with small eyes, red hair, teeth and skin, as well as a red nose, and that is sometimes described as being extremely disgusting. In addition, the female version is also said to have flatter feet, along with thin webbing between their fingers. Both versions of these figures are said to inhabit Tir Fochin, which is envisioned as an enormous country under the waves that is held to be full of riches. In order to navigate this country, the merrow use a device known as a I'm going to struggle on this pronunciation. The merrow use a device known as a corhulin drua, which is described as a red cap made of feathers that they usually take off when on land. However, this act is often a risky one in various folk tales, as if this cap should be stolen, then the merrow will be unable to return to the sea. So, to demonstrate this, I would like to give a summary of one of the prototypical merrow stories, titled The Lady of Golarus, which was recorded by Thomas Crofton Crocker. So one fine summer's morning, a man named Dick Fitzgerald is sat on the shore of Smerwick Harbour. As he smokes his pipe, he laments that he has no companion to talk to but the echo of his own voice, and exclaims, "What in the wide world is a man without a wife?" At that moment, he casts his eye on a rock upon the strand, and to his astonishment he sees a beautiful young woman sat at its base, combing her green hair. Realizing that she is a merrow, and spying the little red cap she uses lying near her, he runs up and seizes it so that she cannot get away. Seeing that her cap is gone, the merrow bursts into tears and begins to cry out. Dick refuses to give up the cap, but he tries as best he can to console the creature, squeezing her webbed hand in sympathy. The merrow asks if he is going to eat her, but instead he asks her to marry him, having fallen in love with her due to her beauty and pretty voice. The merrow agrees, and after fixing her hair, she speaks a few words to the waves. Dick inquires as to what she has said, and she replies that she was just sending word to her father the king of the waves, not to be waiting for her to return for breakfast. The two then set off to a place called Bannin Runnig, where the priest Father Fitzgibbon was that morning. Dick asks him to marry them, but the priest refuses, pointing out that she's a fish, and telling him to return her to her people. At first, Dick attempts to convince the priest to do so by pointing out the Merrow's beauty, and that she is the daughter of a king. Father Fitzgibbon still refuses though, so instead he points out that her father has a lot of money that he would be happy to share with the priest, and Fitzgibbon agrees to marry them as, quote, "Money, you know, is not to be refused in these bad times, and I may as well have the handsel of it as another that maybe would not take," this is really awkwardly worded, "that maybe would not take half the pains in counselling you as I have done." So the two become man and wife, and live happily together in Dick's house in Galeras for a time, where he hides the Merrow's cap in a hole in the wall behind a fishing net. They have 2 boys and a girl, and Dick finds himself to be a happy man. However, one day when Dick is out, the Merrow finds her Corhuli in Drua whilst cleaning. She is at first overjoyed at seeing it, and being able to return to the sea and her family there, but becomes conflicted when she thinks of her children and her love for Dick, and how it would break his heart if she left. She resolves only to go away for a while and then to return, as he would not blame her for wanting to see her father and mother after being away from them so long. However, upon returning to the sea, all her memories of her life on land vanish, and she never returns to Dick or her children. Dick himself would never remarry, and instead waited the rest of his life for her to return in vain, as he believed that she had been forcefully kept below the waters by her father, and that she would never willingly abandon her husband and children. So this is kind of another story in the theme that we discussed before of a man kidnapping some sort of supernatural female, and then that figure managing to escape and make their way back home. This story also runs alongside the general trend that tangling with a Merrow is thought to result in ill fortune, that they are generally seen as creatures of doom by sailors, and this is due to their siren-like habit of using their singing to lure men to their deaths. So the next figure I want to briefly discuss is that of the puka. This figure is usually thought to be the same figure as the English puck that we discussed previously, due to their obviously similar etymology and the fact that they share some similar characteristics, or at least the puka shares some characteristics with other creatures that are often lumped in with puck, such as the brownie, for example. It's also notable that versions of this word appear in the Cornish, Welsh, and Scandinavian languages, and there is indeed quite a bit of debate as to whether it is of Celtic, Scandinavian, or Germanic origin. I'm not going to go into this today as I'm not a linguist, but if you want to read about it, there's a paper out there by Erin Sebo titled "Does Old English Pucker Have an Irish Origin?" The basic conclusion I got skim reading that as a lay reader is we're not sure where it comes from, basically. So the actual characteristics of the Irish puka are somewhat vague, and they vary substantially from one account to the next. According to Thomas Keightley, in his book The Fairy Mythology, illustrative of the romance and superstition of various countries, the puka are described as, quote, wicked-minded, black-looking, bad things, which often took the form of wild asses covered in chains. In other accounts, however, they are seen to be fairly well disposed towards humans, as long as they are treated correctly, though these stories can also have some negative, if not too severe, consequences. So an example of a more light-hearted story regarding a puka comes to us from W.B. Yeats' book Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, and the story itself is titled The Kildare Puka. So according to the story, which was given by a Mr. Patrick Kennedy, there was a big household in Dublin that was blighted by a puka, whilst its master was in exile due to him being involved in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. For context, this was a major rebellion against British rule in Ireland by excluded Presbyterians, and that was also joined by much of the Catholic population. However, it ultimately ended in their brutal suppression, which saw widespread executions and atrocities by the victorious British, and contributed to the merging of the, until that point, semi-independent Irish Parliament with that of Britain under the Acts of Union 1800. In the story itself, we are told that every night the servants within the house were terrified by an inexplicable banging of the kitchen door, along with a strange clattering of fire irons, pots, and plates. One night they sat up late in the kitchen, telling each other all sorts of ghost stories to keep their spirits up, which went on for so long that a small scullery boy who had crept behind the hearth fell asleep without anyone noticing. Later that night, after all had gone to bed and the fire had died down, the boy was awakened by the opening of the kitchen door and the sound of hooves on the floor. He watched from his hiding spot as a creature resembling a large ass made itself comfortable by the hearth. After stirring the fire, the puka went and got a large pot and filled it with water and put it over the hearth to broil. At this point he spied the boy behind the fire and seized him up with one great hoof, but to the boy's relief, rather than eating him, he simply gave him a disgusted look and deposited him back in his hiding place. After that, he proceeded to boil every plate in the kitchen inside the pot until they were clean, then he swept up the room and raked the fire. He fixed the boy with a diabolical grin, and then as he left the room, he gave the door a fierce slap, such that the boy was surprised the whole house didn't fall down from the force of the blow. The next morning, the boy tells the other servants his story, and they can talk of little else for the rest of the day. A scullery maid, who is described as particularly lazy, takes the opportunity to point out that there is little point in them tidying up if the puka is cleaning the whole place each night, and so the servants neglect their chores. That night, the boy stays up once again, and after the puka has cleaned the place, he finally manages to speak up. He asks the puka, or puka, I keep using it interchangeably, he asks the puka if he would be so kind as to do half the girl's work each day, and the puka replies that it would be happy to do so. He then reveals to the boy that he had in fact been a servant at the same house in life, but he was so lazy that upon his death he was given the punishment of having to labour here each and every night, and then to be banished outside into the cold. The boy asks if there is anything that they can do to ease the comfort of the creature, and the puka replies that he could do with a nice quilted coat to keep him warm. The next night, but 2, the boy was there again, holding a fine warm coat. The puka was much pleased by the coat, which he put on immediately, and thanked the boy for bringing it. He then reveals that his curse was meant to last only until someone judged him worthy of being rewarded for his work. Now that the boy has done so, he has no obligation to remain and clean the house, and so he departed immediately, never to be seen again. So yeah, another example of a folkloric creature that is inadvertently run off by offering it clothes. So the final creature I have prepared for my section today is the Irish death messenger, the Banshee. And to illustrate this creature and its main aspect, I have one last story prepared. This tale again appears in Crocker's Fairy Legends and Traditions, and is titled simply The Banshee. In this story, we are told that in the mid-18th century, the Reverend Charles Bunworth was rector of the town of Buttevant in County Cork. Just a bit of background to this story. Charles Bunworth was an actual historical person, and Thomas Crocker is thought to have been a great-grandson of him. So it's possible that what he is telling here is in fact a family legend. So Reverend Charles was much loved by the folk of the surrounding country, regardless of their faith, and he was known far and wide for his proficiency with the Irish harp. In this role, he was a generous host to the many wandering bards who at that time still travelled around the country, who sang his praises in return for his hospitality, and by the time of his passing, no less than 15 of them had made him gifts of their harp. Roughly a week before his death, a strange noise was heard at the door of his hall one evening that was said to resemble the shearing of sheep. No one paid any great attention to it, however, and it wasn't until nearly 11 p.m. that any further concern was raised. It was at this time that the Bunworth's herdsman, Kavanagh, returned from being sent to get medicine for the ailing Reverend, and was seen to be much agitated. The Reverend's daughter, Miss Bunworth, asked him whatever was the matter, at which point he declared that the master would soon be going, and burst into tears. Thinking the man was drunk, Miss Bunworth told him that her father was in fact sleeping softly, as might well be expected. Kavanagh informed her that, quote, "The Banshee has come for him, miss. 'Tis not I alone who have heard her." Miss Bunworth dismissed his words as superstition, but the herdsman told her that he had seen her as he came through the glen of Ballybeg. He described her as being wrapped in a cloak and having long white hair that fell to her shoulders, and said that she would screech, clap her hands, and repeat the master's name. From that day, the Reverend's health continued to slowly decline. The night before his death, both his daughters had become exhausted by ministering to him, and instead an elderly woman and friend sat by his bedside, whilst the house itself was filled with many other followers of his family. The head of his bed was placed by the window, and as the sick man slept, the night was serene and moonlit. Suddenly the tranquillity was broken by the sound of a disturbance outside. The rose tree that grew outside the window was thrust aside, and a low moaning sound and clapping noise was heard outside the glass. Panicked by the sound, the old woman ran into an adjoining room and asked the men there if she had heard the banshee. The men were sceptical that it was such a creature, and went outside to investigate. After walking around the grounds, they found everything to be silent and untouched, and there was no mark on the tree from where it had been thrust aside, and despite the fresh soil beneath it, there were no footprints that an intruder may have left. On returning to the house, however, they found that those who had remained within had continued to hear the moaning and clapping even louder than before, and upon closing the door, they themselves heard it start up once more. After this, Mr. Bunworth grew more and more ill with each passing hour, until finally, as the first glimpse of morning appeared, he died. Now, there is a reason that I started this section on the banshee with a story instead of a general description, as I have for the other creatures. That's because the banshee is something of a variable figure in both Irish and Scottish folklore, about which the only thing that can be said with certainty is that it resembles a woman and that its appearance heralds a death. For a start, we know of a number of different regional names for the creature, of which banshee is only the most common. According to a map of historical sources produced by Professor Patricia Lysat in her book The Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger, belief in the tradition of a death messenger appears to have historically been widespread throughout Ireland. Whilst the name banshee has likely been the dominant name for centuries, there is evidence of other names for this entity, particularly in southeastern Ireland. These include the Ban Huente or Kinte, which means roughly a keening woman, along with Bibe, Bow, and Bow. It has been argued that the latter of these are derived from the similarly spelt Bave, who is the war crow, and who in various stories of Irish mythology appears alongside Macha and Niamh as the trio of goddesses that collectively make up the Morrigan, although in some tales the Morrigan is kind of a separate entity from these figures. Much as it has these varying names, the appearance of the banshee varies significantly depending on individual reports. Sometimes she is said to be young or old, to be small or tall, and to be dressed in a white, green, or red dress, and sometimes to have either a grey or a white cloak. Whilst her facial features are only rarely discussed, she is occasionally said to be either beautiful or ugly, and is sometimes said to have long golden hair, which according to Patricia Lysat is a stereotype that denotes female beauty. In cases where she is said to be beautiful, there is, however, no erotic element to the beauty, and unlike other fairies, there are no known examples where a man falls in love with or marries a banshee. Despite all these different visual depictions, it is actually more common in these tales for the banshee to be heard rather than seen, and the sound of its call also differs between the tellings. It is most commonly described as a cry, a wail, or a lament, and on occasion as a more aggressive scream, roar, or screech, which in the case of the Ban Huente is occasionally said to be so loud that it can shatter glass. Outside of these physical characteristics, the banshee is somewhat unusual compared to other fairies, to the point where there has historically been something of a debate over whether it should be classed as a fairy or not. For a start, it is extremely solitary. There are no mentions of banshee communities, and there is no evidence of it having any male counterpart. It is, however, accompanied in some tales by an immense black coach, pulled by headless horses and driven by a headless man. This is a variant on the figure of the Dullahan, which is the Irish headless horseman, which I've chosen not to really go into here because A, we probably want to do a Halloween-style episode on headless horsemen at some point, and the Irish headless horseman forms a core part of that entity's traditions. And also, he is relatively firmly an undead creature, and so not really in the remit that I've given myself for today's episode. Interestingly, there are also some folkloric traditions where the banshee is a spirit or a ghost rather than a fairy that I thought deserved mentioning here, though these are generally less common than it being a fairy. A final unique aspect of this creature is that rather than being a generic portent of doom, individual banshees are often said to haunt specific families of old Irish stock. So a good example of this can be found in the story Legends of the Banshee, which is also in Thomas Crocker's collection. I haven't gone into this story today in detail, just because it's very long and we've been here quite a while already. But one interesting aspect of this story is that it also indicates that the Banshee can herald a death by misadventure or accident, rather than just a death by illness or old age. So the final thing I want to mention with regards to the Banshee is that there is a variant figure found in the Scottish Highland tradition, which is known as the Ben Nia, or the Washing Woman. Unlike the more spectral Banshee, she is said to be encountered at desolate streams in the wilderness, where she appears as a small woman dressed in green with red feet and drooping breasts, and who is generally seen washing the blood-stained clothing of whoever it is that is about to die. Whilst her appearance generally portends evil, if anyone sees her before she sees them, then she is obligated to answer 3 questions, which she must answer truthfully. And finally, if anyone is bold enough to get close to her and seize one of her breasts and suckle from it, then they will earn the right to call themselves her foster child, and in doing so, gain her protection. So, I think that's quite enough of Ireland's somewhat distinct fairy traditions, and as such, I'm going to pass over to you again, Crofty, to conclude this episode by talking about the one part of the British Isles that we haven't really spoken much about, which is Scotland.
Thank you, Charles. And weird place to end that one on.
Yeah, I know. It's just kind of how that all came together at the end. But I wanted to go into something a bit more grim for that little bit.
I was just not expecting that last little bit.
I mean, I wasn't expecting it when I was reading it either. I kind of did a double take. So
yeah, I don't think any of the rest of my Scottish stuff gets quite that weird, but we'll see. So for this last section, I'm going to be sort of tracing the development of the main archetype of fairies in Scotland through history. I'm not quite going to start at the beginning though, because there is a major source who collated a lot of the important information on Scottish fairies from various sources of folklore and has been one of the big names in our understanding and our modern view of Scottish fairies. And that is the scholar Reverend Robert Kirk, who in 1691, or around 1691, wrote a manuscript called The Secret Commonwealth. Kirk himself is also quite an interesting character who does bear some description here before I go into the fairies themselves. He was born in 1644 as the 7th son of James Kirk, whose middle initial and Starfleet rank are unknown, who was the minister for Aberfoyle in Perthshire. Kirk was particularly fascinated all his life by psychic phenomena, and he believed that the circumstances of his birth made him gifted in such areas. He would claim that, and I quote, "There is some secret virtue in the womb of the parent, which increaseth until the 7th son be born, and decreaseth by the same degree afterwards." And it was likely this belief that led to the focus of his studies in otherworldly creatures. He read theology at St Andrews University before completing a master's in Edinburgh, and then followed his father's footsteps into the clergy, becoming minister first at Balquhidder, a small parish in Perthshire, before taking on his father's position at Aberfoyle in 1685. He spoke and wrote both Gaelic and English, which served him first in translating the Bible into Gaelic, I believe one of the first Gaelic translations of the Bible, and also served him well in his work to collect accounts of fairies from the people of the Highlands and document them for publication, as he believed that by documenting these accounts, as told by the common folk, he would vindicate belief in heaven, hell, and the supernatural against the rising number of skeptics that he encountered among the more learned classes when he visited London. He would compose his manuscript sometime before 1691, however, the earliest surviving printed version was published by the author Walter Scott in 1815. This edition has a note stating that it was transcribed from a manuscript that was dated as 1691 and was given by Kirk's son Colin Kirk to the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh, which at the time served as the National Library for Scotland. This manuscript has been missing since Scott's publication, however.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there are 3 other manuscripts, I believe, that are in the library. So there are other records of it. Just This one, for some reason, went missing. It's strange. There's not an explanation for it. So shortly after completing this manuscript, in 1692, Kirk died of unknown causes at aged 51. A tombstone exists in the graveyard of his church in Aberfoyle, which is simply inscribed Robertus Kirk AM Linguae Hibernii Lumen, which Google tells me translates from Latin as the light of winter tongues. I specify that it's a tombstone that exists because, supposedly, there is no body or ashes in the grave. Kirk's successor, the Reverend Graham Dushray, claimed that Kirk did not in fact die. He told that Kirk was walking on a dunshee, or a fairy hill, in the parish, when he fell into a swoon which was taken for death. Following the funeral ceremony, Kirk's ghost would appear to his cousin, commanding the cousin, "Go to Graham of Dushray, say to Dushray, who is my cousin as well as your own, that I am not dead, but captive in fairyland, and only one chance remains for my liberation. When the posthumous child, of which my wife has been delivered since my disappearance, shall be brought to baptism, I will appear in the room, when, if Dushray shall throw over my head the knife or dirk which he holds in his hand, I may be restored to society. But if this is neglected, I am lost forever." Dushray claims that the Reverend Kirk did indeed appear at the baptism, but he was so astonished that he did not think to throw his dirk as he was commanded, and so Kirk was not restored to the mortal world.
That sounds like a thing that definitely happened.
Yes, very true. Completely corroborated by reliable sources.
Yep. Sorry, this is like...
Don't look for them.
Yeah, not to be like a bunch of internet skeptics about this, but it's just, it's like, if you knew this thing was going to happen, like, why didn't you throw the dirk? Anyway.
Yeah.
It's a very convenient excuse in a lot of these accounts that, I was too shocked or frightened. I'm like, yeah, I guess I understand that, but... like,
you had fair warning.
Yeah.
So the fate that Kirk met in this legend has been suggested to be the consequence of his investigation into the fairies and revealing their secrets. While stories of fairies had been common among the people of Scotland since at least the 13th century, and most likely even earlier, it was Kirk who first put to writing a definition of the fairies of Scotland in the opening paragraph of his book. And I quote, "These she, or fairies, they call Shlieg Var, or good people, it would seem, to prevent the dint of their ill attempts, for the Irish use to bless all they fear harm of, and are said to be of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, as were daemons thought to be of old, of intelligent fluidous spirits, and light changeable bodies, like those called astral, somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud, and best seen in twilight." It's a very long run-on sentence, I realise. For anyone who speaks any Gaelic, I will justify my pronunciation of Shleig Var in that the second word is the same as the Scottish toast Slancha which is the only thing I know definitely how to pronounce in Gaelic. So if it's pronounced differently here, I apologise. But it's the same meaning. It's good in both terms. Good for people or your good health. So Kirk would then go on to describe the varying physical aspects of fairies, describing some as being thin and delicate and only able to feed on fine spirits and pure air, some that would feed on corn growing from the earth, using invisibility to steal it. He described fairies that were known to live within hillocks, who have been seen to bake bread and forge metal with hammers. He would name an individual type of fairy as brownies, who we've mentioned a few times before. Fairy bodies were supposedly made of congealed air, and they could levitate due to being so light. Many could shapeshift, and they could enter any cleft in the earth that air could pass through, and make their homes in these cavities. Since the earth was so full of these cavities, he said, there is no place unoccupied by both fairies and humans, and so no such thing as a pure wilderness in the world, because fairies inhabit those places humans cannot.
Something I should just quickly jump in and say is I went into before about how fairies are not really seen to have had wings in visual representations until the 19th century. There are still, however, plenty of earlier accounts where fairies are able to fly or float or levitate or whatever. So, yeah, I just want to quickly make that distinction because I realised I hadn't spoken about it before.
Yeah, same with the Welsh where the lake fairies were said to be floating across the lake.
Yeah.
Kirk would go on to claim, when several countries were uninhabited by us, these fairies had their early tillage above the ground, as we do now. The print of these fairies do yet remain to be seen on the shoulders of very high hills, which was done when the ground was wood and forest. This particular claim hints at something that has been suggested as a possible historical origin for fairy belief in Scotland, which are the ruins left behind by the Picts. The Picts inhabited the Scottish Highlands, the Orkney Islands, and the Shetland Islands around the 3rd century. Their culture had been fully assimilated into Gaelic culture by the 10th century, as the Dalriata people expanded from western Scotland, forming the Kingdom of Alba, and the Pictish culture was lost, with most knowledge of it only recorded by external sources. Pictish monuments and the ruins of Iron Age roundhouses called brocks, which would later be occupied by the Picts, are thought to be the print of the fairies that Coate describes, and the expansion of the Gaelic peoples into the Scottish Highlands being instead claimed as the expansion of humans into the Highlands, displacing fairies and forcing them underground. How much of this represents actual fairy belief, however, is uncertain. Kirk does not elaborate on how he connects the print he sees on the high hills with the fairies of old, so whether this does reflect the true belief of the Scottish people in the preceding centuries, or whether it reflects just Kirk's own observations, isn't clear. Evidence of belief in a supernatural or underground fairy realm does go at least as far back as the 13th century. This might be long enough for superstitions to have developed around the remains of Pictish society in the minds of the common people, but to my knowledge we don't have any direct references to back that up. Pictish sites are not the only sites that would become associated with the fairies. In the county of Caithness, on Scotland's north coast, sit 2 long-chambered cairns on Knock Frederican, or Freycidan. Yeah, I'm not going to get a better pronunciation than that.
Yeah,
I apologise.
I'm looking at it and I'm like, I'm scared.
There's a lot of letters.
Yeah. There are a lot of letters in all sorts of orders.
Yeah, there's letters that have no right to be there. The English name for it is the Watcher's Hill.
Yeah, I apologise in advance to anyone who dwells in one of the Celtic nations. Those letters have every right to be there. It's the English who don't have the right to be there.
Yes, that's correct. We really don't. I'm sorry for butchering your languages. I am going to learn Welsh. I promise, one day.
I mean, you have to be Prince of Wales, so it tracks.
Yeah. I've lost my thread now. The Watcher's Hill, cairns.
Yeah.
Cairns on the Watcher's Hill. These cairns are some 5,000 years old, and from their shape they earned the name Na Trai Shitheen, or the 3 fairy mounds.
Yeah.
And similar Neolithic sites and natural features of the landscape have been given fairy-themed names over the years that suggest that they may once have been seen as Kirk's prints of fairy habitation.
Yeah, a good example of an English version of that is somewhere like Wayland Smithy, for example, which is like a Neolithic barrow.
Folklorists in the 19th century would make the case for Picts as the origins of fairy-related legends, particularly as the inspiration for varieties of fairy that were described as little people living underground, such as the Brownies or the Trowies of Orkney. This is based on the archaeological features of the brocks and of the underground storage chambers known as souterrains, which were built during the early Pictish time. The brocks were accessed by small steps leading to small entrances, too small for a person of regular height to enter when stood up. The souterrains were long and low-roofed storage chambers, again, possibly too low for a person to stand up inside them. This, combined with a 13th century text called the Historia Norwegiae, which described the Picts of Orkney as little exceeding pygmies in stature, led to the popular idea that Picts were of a size comparable to brownies. This idea has since been debunked. The historian's description is thought to be propaganda against a conquered people, while the features described of brocks and souterrains were reflective of their function. A brock's smaller entrance would be much more defensible than a regular-sized entrance, and the storage chamber probably wouldn't need a high ceiling, and there's no other archaeological evidence to suggest that the Picts were particularly small.
Another interesting aspect of the brocks is a lot of time people kind of mention them as like a defensive fortification, but if so, they have no actual windows to like fire missiles out or anything like that. So their actual function is a little bit obscure.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for clarifying that, because I don't have much to go on with them, unfortunately. So rather than fairies being based on a memory of the Picts, the Pictish association is more likely something that was added later by scholars attempting to rationalise stories of small-statured brownies and trowies, or human-sized fairies able to slip through small entrances into underground realms. So, after his suggestion of fairies preceding humans as the surface-dwelling inhabitants of Scotland, Kirk goes on to describe aspects of fairy society and appearance. He claims that fairies are migratory, moving between homes at the beginning of each quarter of the year, being uncomfortable, remaining sedentary, and finding ease in the journey. He claims that seers, or men but not women, of the second sight, will encounter them on the roads at night at this time, and that all superstitious people will be sure to attend church on the first Sunday of each quarter, even if they do not otherwise attend. Additionally, as an island, the festivals of Bealtaine and Samhain would be particularly important to the fairies, with many stories taking place on these days. Kirk describes the fairies as being human in appearance and their society as being divided into tribes and orders. He says that they have children, nurses, marriages, deaths and burials, similar to humans, but that they may be displaying such aspects of society for show in imitation of humans. Outside of their travelling days, fairies were most commonly seen at funerals and banquets, partaking of the meat on offer, and so many people would not eat the meat at these events for fear of being poisoned by fairies or tricked into communion with them. Some would also be seen carrying the coffin at funerals, possibly of a person whose spirit that they may be taking to fairyland with them. On occasion where humans have been taken to the homes of the fairies, Kirk says that these people describe the houses as large and fair, invisible by vulgar eyes unless revealed by the fairies themselves. They are lit by ever-burning lamps and fires, with no fuel sustaining them. Many of these dwellings would be in places that became known as fairy hills, and the Highlanders would not take earth or wood from these hills for fear of angering the fairies within. These houses are very spacious, but goings-on within them could not be discerned by humans who had been brought there unless they either possessed the second sight or had anointed their eyes with what Kirk calls a certain unction, though if the fairies found out that a person had done so, they would be blinded. According to Kirk, most people who would be kidnapped and taken to the fairies' dwellings would be women who had recently given birth in order to act as nurses for young fairies. When they were no longer needed, some would be returned, but some would be offered the chance to stay in fairyland. However, earlier folk stories do more often tell of men being kidnapped, and many of these stories would later be composed into ballads and passed down orally until they were finally collected and written down by Francis Child in the 19th century. One ballad in particular that I'm going to focus on is thought to be drawn from one of the earliest stories of a fairy kidnapping in Scotland. This story was previously written as a medieval romance in the late 14th century, and it concerns a 13th century historical figure and is believed to have originated during or shortly after his lifetime as legends grew around the feats that had been attributed to him. This person is Sir Thomas de Ercildoune, better known as Thomas the Rhymer, a laird of Earlston in what is now Berwickshire, and a writer to whom an early version of Tristram and Iseult is attributed. Tristram and Iseult being part of the Arthurian canon that we discussed quite some time ago. Thomas had also been given the title of True Thomas due to claims that he could not tell a lie, and this expanded into legends attributing the power of prophecy to him. The most famous prophecy that was attributed to him in 1286 was predicting that a change in the wind the following day before noon was going to herald the death of King Alexander III of Scotland. He gave this prediction to the Earl of Dunbar. At 9 o'clock the following morning, when there had been no change in the weather, the Earl summoned Thomas to hold him to account for giving a false prophecy. Thomas said the hour had not yet come, and sure enough, by noon, the wind had changed and news reached them of the king's death. And this is, like I said, the most famous prophecy attributed. And his prophetic abilities were explained due to association with the fairies. The legend goes that while resting under a tree on Eildon Hill, Thomas saw a beautiful woman passing by. He addressed her as the Queen of Heaven, as that is the only person that a woman of such beauty could be. She says that she is no one so lofty, instead being the Queen of Fairyland, or in some variants the Queen of Elfheim. Thomas propositions her, but she says she will lose her beauty if they lay together. He doesn't take no for an answer, and she eventually consents to marry him. Together, accompanied by the Queen's hunting dogs, they travel to Fairyland, during which the Queen points out the path to heaven and the path to hell. The road takes them through an underground land of perpetual twilight and bountiful orchards, in which they cross a river to enter the Queen's realm. Thomas could see neither the sun or the moon, but he could always hear the roaring of the sea. Thomas spent 3 days feasting and dancing with the fairies, and he lay with the Queen 7 times, after which she transformed into a hag. After 3 days, she takes him back to the mortal world, where either 3 years or 7 years have passed, depending on the manuscript. Thomas asks for a token to remember his time with her, and she offers him the choice between unparalleled skill at the harp and a tongue which can never lie and so can tell the future, and Thomas chooses the latter. Just 1 second. Ow.
I'm not seeing what she really gets out of this, to be honest.
He was apparently that good at laying with her.
Yeah, but only 7 times. Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah, that's the only explanation I can give.
Yeah, she is an immortal being, it seems. Anyway.
This story would first be published towards the end of the 14th century as prose, and would later on be adapted into a ballad. The surviving manuscript of the 14th century version, collected in the Lincoln Codex, compiled by Robert Thornton, is not thought to be the original version of the story. The narrative begins in first person in this version, before switching to third and back to first, and the use of first person has been argued to imply that there was an original written version by Rymer himself, which was adapted. The manuscript also contains a list of prophecies, and because of this, it's also used as evidence that the original version can be attributed to Rymer, implying he gave the tale of his encounter with the Fairy Queen as part of an effort to record his prophecies and justify why he could make such predictions. The manuscript was later published in print in the 19th century by the lexicographer Sir James Augustus Henry Murray of Denham in the Scottish Borders, in which he also discussed what is known of Rymer's life and local oral traditions surrounding Thomas that are separate from the literary versions. He cites one local version of the legend, told for some time in Elston, which states that Thomas was carried off at a very young age to Fairyland, and we're going to assume this means early adulthood here. This version says he lived there for 7 years with no mention of him perceiving any shorter time, and in those 7 years he acquired a vast array of knowledge, learning the skills of a prophet that way. After 7 years, he was permitted to return, or sent back to the human world, specifically to enlighten his countrymen with his knowledge and his prophetic abilities, but all his life he was still bound to the Queen of Fairy and must return when she wished. Many decades later, while Thomas was making merry with his friends in the tower at Ercildown, a person burst in, telling of a hart and a hind that had left the forest and were composedly and slowly parading the streets of the village. Thomas immediately stood up, left, walked out, and followed these animals into the forest, and was never seen again. Murray says that, according to popular belief, Thomas still drees his weird in Fairyland, which is my new favourite euphemism.
Yes.
I'm going to be using it from now on.
Just use it wildly out of context, yeah.
Yes. And once he's done dreeing his weird, Thomas is expected to return to Earth one day. The Eildon tree on Eildon Hill, where he supposedly delivered his prophecies and was supposedly the entrance to Fairyland, no longer existed by Murray's time, but locals had marked the spot with a stone fittingly named the Eildon Tree Stone. There are other literary sources that describe stories of a fairy queen kidnapping a mortal man, but with much darker intentions. And to illustrate this, I'm going to use another famous ballad, the story of Tam Lin. This story dates back to sometime before 1549, though whether it relates to a possible historical figure or to an older oral tradition is lost. The earliest recorded mention is in a list of Scottish romances in The Complaint of Scotland, a text published during the war with England containing legends, ballads, and biblical verse to emphasise Scotland's virtues and the worth of defending them from English ambition. While it doesn't tell the story of Tam Lin, the fact that it is mentioned does imply that the tale had been popular for quite some time. So the story contains quite a lot of elements that do appear throughout Scottish fairy folklore. So to briefly tell it, so to tell it in full, it's not as brief as I'd like. So to tell it in full.
Yeah.
So to tell it in full here, if I may.
Only if you do it briefly.
I'll try. No promises. A woman, usually named Janet, enters the forest of Carterhaugh in the Scottish borders. When she plucks a double rose, a man appears, introducing himself as Tam Lin and asking why she takes what is his. Janet tells him that the lands of Carterhaugh in fact belong to her, as part of her father's estate, that he has deemed are hers. After returning to her father's home, it is revealed that Janet is now pregnant with a child she claims is fathered by an elfin grey. And unusually, for a work of its time, Janet is very defiant and unashamed of her actions. She claims that her affair with Tam Lin was her choice, and she had refused any man at court before. So, she returns to Carterhaugh to meet Tam Lin again, and to learn whether he is truly a fairy. She asks him whether ere ye was in a holy chapel or Christendom did see, and Tam Lin explains that his grandfather, the Duke of Roxburgh, took him riding, and as they were returning from the hunt, he fell from his horse. The Queen of the Fairies caught him and took him to Fairyland within the Green Hill in the forest. However, her motives were not simply to save him from his injuries or to show him the wonders of Fairyland, and she would not bestow any gifts on him as she did to Thomas the Rhymer, as Tam Lin explains. And pleasant is the Fairyland, but an airy tale to tell. Aye, at the end of 7 years we pay attend to hell. I am sae fair and full of flesh, I am feared it be myself. He tells Janet how to save him from the fate of being given to hell as part of the teend or teeth, and that the fairies owe. He says he will ride at Miles Cross as part of a procession at midnight on Halloween night, and there she can win him back for the human world. He says that he'll be riding the white steed that is third in the procession, and she is to run up and pull him down from his horse. He describes how he will be dressed so that she can see him, and says that she is to hold tight to him as the fairies will turn him into different shapes: a newt, an adder, a bear, a lion, among others, and that she is to hold fast to him as she would her own child. When finally he turns into a glowing coal, she is to throw him immediately into the water of a nearby well, and he will turn back into his knightly human form, completely naked. She is then to cover him in her green mantle to conceal him from the Fairy Queen. Janet successfully follows these instructions, and sure enough, Tam Lin is restored as a human and she covers him with her mantle. The ballad ends with the appearance of the Fairy Queen and a final threat to Janet. Out then spake the Queen of Fairies out of a bush o' broom, them that has gotten young Tam Lin has gotten a stately groom. Out then spake the queen of the fairies, and an angry woman was she. Shame betide her ill-fared face, and an ill death may she die. For she's taken away the bonniest knight in all my company. But had I kenned Tamlin, she says, what now this night I see, I would have taken out their 2 green eyes and put 2 in a tree. I butchered a little bit of the Scottish there, I apologise.
Yeah, I got the transliteration that you sent me in front of me, and I'm like, you did well. That's not bad.
Yeah. A few bits I just went for my normal English. It was easier.
Yeah, I deliberately, some of the some of the Irish creatures, some of the stories had some like transcriptions of actual like attempting to mimic the Irish accent. I decided not to go with that.
Yeah, I tried not to go with that, and that last bit slipped in there. My bad.
Yeah, looking at how it's written, it is difficult not to.
Yeah. So, the ballad contains several elements that we see throughout other Scottish sources of fairy folklore, and while the written version is from the 19th century, it is still a good example of many of the things believed in Scotland about fairies in the preceding centuries. From the beginning, we see a common fate of those taken to fairyland to return partially to the mortal world and to deal with mortals in some way. The opening verses warn young maidens that if they venture to Carterhaugh, they will encounter the mysterious Tamlin, who may take something from them, and I quote, either their rings or green mantles or else their maidenhead. Green mantles are also particularly associated with fairies, as we've discussed before, with the fairy queen often depicted as wearing one herself. And of course, sex with the fairies, or sex with humans taken by fairies, is a particularly common theme of many of these stories. Tamlin, taking any of these 3 things he mentions, creates a connection with the fairy world that the fairies can later exploit. However, Janet does not heed the warning, and she enters anyway. What goes on between Janet and Tamlin is depicted as being Janet's own choice, and unlike many female leads in these stories, she has her own agency. Janet, being the rightful owner of the land, likely also gives her some power here, due to the common trait of fairies respecting ownership and titles and hierarchy, and so by demonstrating her right to be there, the power dynamic shifted from what others would have experienced, which put Janet in the position to save Tamlin later. Tamlin's story, while being very different, obviously, to Thomas the Rhymer's, does contain an element that is mentioned in some versions of Rhymer's, the Teind paid to hell. Versions of Thomas the Rhymer state that the reason the fairy queen sent him back to the human world after 7 years was because every 7 years this must be paid, and the queen did not want to be forced to offer Rhymer as payment. However, in Tamlin and many other stories where this is mentioned, humans are taken specifically to be used as the payment to prevent the fairy queen from having to give up fairies to hell. And then we have Janet, with the power that comes from being the owner of the land, is in a position to break the spell and free Tamlin from being part of this debt. The rescue scene, after Tamlin is pulled from the horse, might sound familiar to you, Charles, and to regular listeners. Rescuing a human from a magical captor by holding on to them while the captor transforms them into multiple shapes is a story that has appeared throughout Europe.
Yeah.
This includes how Peleus, the king of Pythia, won the hand of the sea nymph Thetis, the daughter of Proteus, in Greek mythology, which would go on to have them begetting Achilles. This story is cited by Homer in the Iliad, by Apollonius of Rhodes in the Argonautica, and by Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca. If your memory is particularly good, you might also remember a similar rescue of a mortal from the Finnish hag Sujatar in our Baba Yaga episode, where the prince had to kill each form that his bride transformed into until she became human again, all the way back in episode 4. So it is possible that versions of this story are so old as to either have been influenced by the Romans or influenced by elements of Finnish folklore that were transmitted via Norse trade routes.
I, of course, know this story from its clearly like perfected, greatest possible way that you could ever represent it, which is it's how you beat the final boss in the point-and-click adventure game King's Quest V, where it's like a series of ways to continue like grappling with and defeating the opponent over and over again. But
nice.
Only very old and sad people who played Sierra games will not understand that reference.
Yeah, I don't understand that one. It might more be referenced to Heracles and Achilles, but that's a whole other episode. Anyway, Tamlin.
Yes.
Sorry, we've been going a while.
I think that's the first time in 25 years I'd have a chance to mention King's Quest to someone, so I thought, my time has come.
Yes, finally. Anyway, the story, the rescue, the transformations. The rescue is completed when Janet covers Tamlin with her own green mantle, which suggests an element of protection in items that bear a connection to the fairies. When the Fairy Queen herself appears, she's not the benevolent Fairy Queen that Thomas the Rhymer met, and is instead threatening Janet and stating that she would have blinded Tamlin had she known, which, as I've mentioned before, is a common element in fairy stories, blinding their human captives who see too much or who show too much agency. In this case, though, the method of being blinded is much more dramatic and permanent by making two eyes made out of wood, which is the reference to e'en a tree, rather than many first-hand reports which would only refer to temporary blindness or the loss of the second sight. If the Fairy Queen's motives in the story seem scary, however, there are many stories where leaving with or staying with the fairies would have been preferable to staying in or returning to the human world. I have mentioned before that there were accounts from the 14th century onwards of kidnappings by fairies, particularly new mothers who could nurse fairy children, and I have mentioned Robert Kirk's view that fairies were not creatures of hell, but between humans and angels. However, there was a period where the official view of fairies was very different, and where folklore has quite a discernible impact on history. So in 1563, during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, the Scottish Witchcraft Act came into force, making witchcraft, consulting with witches or demonic forces, a capital crime. It was during this time that the Church began to see fairies as demonic entities, culminating in the description of fairies in King James VI of Scotland's book, Demonology. In his chapter on fairies, James wrote of the common description of fairies given during interrogations of witches, and described them as such. There was a king and queen of fairy, of such a jolly court and train as they had, and how they had a teind and a duty, as it were, of all goods, how they naturally rode and went, ate and drank, and did all the other actions like natural men and women. After a brief digression, he would go on to say that sundry witches have gone to death with that confession, that they have been transported with the fairy to such a hill, which opening they went in, and there saw a fair queen, who being now lighter, gave them a stone that had sundry virtues, which at sundry times hath been produced in judgment. He alleges that the fairy spirits described by so many witches are in fact forms created by the devil, to appear more benevolent than demons, and thus entice more people to consort with them. He says this despite the fact that he has already mentioned the fairy's debt to hell that came up in the story of Tamlin, and a claim which was mentioned in some of the witch trials. However, while King James may have been influenced by his study of witchcraft and his fanaticism for persecuting witches when declaring that fairies were demons, the witch trials themselves offer the most direct source of information on the common folk beliefs about fairies. It is important here to note that for those not aware of the history of witch trials, they did not follow any form of due process. The accused would be treated as guilty from the start, and a confession would be extracted under torture. Leaving aside just how horrific an act that is, we now understand that confessions under torture are not reliable. The victim's confession is their attempt to tell the interrogator what they want to hear. However, for our purposes today, there is an element of truth that we can take from them. While the acts that the victims confess can't be considered to be true, the descriptions of supernatural entities are likely to reflect common beliefs or commonly told stories of the time. The similarities between descriptions in different confessions show a common base of knowledge to draw from when the victims attempted to appease their interrogators, and creating a whole fairy story under torture is basically impossible. They would have had to draw from some previous knowledge somewhere. So, from these various transcripts of confessions, the majority of meetings with witches and fairies occurred on hills, with some entering fairyland by passing inside the hill through some hidden route. One particularly famous location was the Downey Hills in Angus, near Aberdeen, which would be a part of the trial of Isabel Godey and feature in the poem Halloween by Robert Burns, and it's likely that many of these hills informed Robert Kirk's description of fairy hills. Some of these encounters had fairies kidnap the alleged witch and take them into their realm within the hill. For example, the case of Isabel Haldane, who was spirited away in the night and taken within a fairy hill. There she stayed for 3 days, learning the art of healing, before being returned by a grey-bearded man. Some mentions were not direct interactions, such as Catherine Jonesdotter of the Shetland Islands, who, as part of her trial, attested to seeing the small trows on a hill called Greenfell. Some of these meetings were voluntary meetings, such as Lady Catherine Ross of Fowlis in 1590, who would go into the hills to speak with the fairy folk. And here she allegedly procured a fairy arrowhead, whose magical poison she would attempt to use to murder her nephew, Robert Monroe, some 14 years previously. These fairy arrowheads, or elf shot, would be a common feature of witch trials and of the surrounding folklore. A particularly prominent trial mentioning them was the trial of Isabel Godey of Aldern in the Highlands in 1662. Godey confessed that she and a number of other witches flew by magical means to the Downey Hills, entering the fairy realm beneath them. She would feast with the king and queen of fairy, describing the king as being broad-faced and well-favoured, and the queen as being clothed in white linens, and she would be given fairy arrows fashioned by hollow and boss-backed elf boys, which have been suggested to refer to trows or to dwarfs. These arrows, rather than being shot from a bow, would be shot by a flick of the thumb, and their victims would fall dead without a mark on them. Robert Kirk mentions elf shot as a barbed arrowhead of yellow soft flint, flung as a dart with great force, which, and I quote, was of the nature of a thunderbolt, subtly and mortally wounding the vital parts without breaking the skin. Elf shot was also used to describe sudden attacks of illness or death on cattle and horses. Often, these were attributed to witches who had been given elf shot by fairies, but also this was supposedly the method by which fairies would hunt, and they would feed on the life essence of the slain animal. Ironically, many convicted witches were accused of curing the elf shot, which was apparently just as bad as inflicting it. However, Robert Kirk would later claim that he himself had been taught to cure the elf shot simply by finding the point of entry with his finger, and the spirits flowing from a man's warm hand were antidote sufficient against their poisoned darts. So, many of the cases, as well as those being accused of healing elf shot, were women accused more generally of having healing abilities, and the most famous case of a healer allegedly aided by fairies is that of Bessie Dunlop. When she was in labour, she answered the door to a stout woman who begged for a drink. Despite her condition, Bessie obliged, and the woman revealed herself as the Queen of Fairy. At the time, there was a plague and famine in Scotland. Bessie's husband was ill, and their cattle was malnourished. The Queen prophesied that Bessie's child would die of the plague, but that her husband would recover. Shortly after, when Bessie's newborn child was sick, she encountered a stranger with a grey beard and a white walking stick, who addressed her by her first name, and he asked her what made her lament so sadly. She replied that she has great cause to lament, for her possessions are dwindling, her husband is sick, and her baby would not live. The man told her that she had angered God by asking for something that she should not have, before then retreating and entering a narrow hole in a nearby hill that he should not have been able to fit through. He would later appear again to Bessie and promise her wealth, clothing, horses and cows if she would deny her Christianity, but Bessie refused, stating that no threat or promise could make her do that. The man was angry, and he disappeared again. A third time, he would appear at her home and tell her not to speak and not to be afraid of what she was about to see. He took hold of her by the apron and led her outside, where 12 beautiful otherworldly people waited for her. They asked Bessie to go with them, and she did not answer, so they departed in what Bessie described as a hideous, ugly gust of wind which left her nauseated. The man explained that they were the good neighbours of the court of Elfheim, and they desire you to go with them. He again offered her meat and clothes, and she once again refused, angering him again. This man would continue to appear to Bessie for many years, teaching her to make potions and to use charms for healing. When she eventually asked the man why he favoured her so, he explained that he served the Queen of Fairy, who had commanded him to wait upon her and do her good as payment for the water that she gave her many years ago. His name was Thomas Reed, and he claimed that he had died in battle 30 years previously and now resided in Fairyland. With his help, Bessie would become very famous as a local healer and wise woman, though she claimed no knowledge of art or science, and that in each case she consulted him. The people who would come to her for help included a number of members of the nobility. For example, the Lady Johnston, wife of Sir William Wallace of Johnston and Auchenbothe, consulted her about her daughter, who would regularly fall into a swoon and faint. Bessie consulted Reed, who diagnosed her as having cold blood around the heart, essentially low blood pressure, for which he prescribed a potion of ginger, cloves, aniseed and licorice mixed with strong ale, which cured the woman. She was consulted by the Lady Kilboe of Dunbartonshire, who was suffering from a crooked leg, which Bessie could not heal as she found that the bone marrow had wasted away. Reed also gave her a piece of green silk lace, again, common colour associated with the fairies, which, when tied to the left arm of a mother in labour, would ease the birth. She also never professed to having the second sight, but Reed would aid her when people asked her to find stolen property, which people including the wife of the local laird, the Lady Blair, who on multiple occasions asked for aid in finding thieves. It was, however, these same well-to-do clients who would accuse her of witchcraft, including William Kyle of Irvine, for whom she discovered the thief of a cloak, who would then go on to have her arrested after she had recovered his cloak. 2 blacksmiths that she accused of theft also testified that she was a witch, among others, though I can't find the other records of them. Bessie's testimony, along with that of another healer convicted of witchcraft, Alison Pearson of Byrehill, both contain elements that would be common in many fairy stories of Scotland and display the 2 most common traits of Scottish fairies that would influence the modern view of fairies. Both Bessie Dunlop and Alison Pearson did most of their dealings with fairies through an intermediary, in Pearson's case, her deceased uncle. Both had assisted the Fairy Queen on request and were rewarded. That fairies adhere to the principle that one good turn deserves another is the theme of many stories where the fairy requests aid, often something as small as a drink or a meal. For example, one story, The Fairy and the Miller's Wife, the titular miller's wife is nursing her child when a woman, revealed later to be the Fairy Queen, asks if she can spare some oatmeal. The kindness is later repaid by the fairies performing work for the miller overnight, grinding all the day's corn. However, the demands that Bessie and Alison renounce their religion and leave for Fairyland reflect the other side of dealing with fairies, that further aid always comes with strings attached. For example, the story Whoopity Story, which is a Scottish variant. I know, it's a fun name.
Yeah.
Which is a Scottish variant of the famous story of Rumpelstiltskin, where a fairy woman gives aid to a struggling widow, but demands her firstborn child in return. And the only way to break the agreement was to guess the true name of the fairy. In the Scottish version, the widow would overhear the fairy singing her name as Whoopity Story and break the deal, similar to how in Rumpelstiltskin, the woman would hear Rumpelstiltskin saying his name and do the same.
I am very happy that you managed to crowbar in Rumpelstiltskin somehow.
Yeah. And the fun name Whoopity Story.
Yes.
It's too good.
It's worth the price of admission.
While Thomas Reid gave no explanation as to why he served the Fairy Queen, a dead person residing in Fairyland or a person fleeing with the fairies to escape their death is another common feature. We've mentioned the legends surrounding Robert Kirk, kidnapped by fairies after revealing too much about them. We also have examples of people choosing to live with the fairies over their fate of certain death. For example, the story of Sir Godfrey MacCulloch, who aided a fairy living inside the hill on which his house was built, and years later the fairy would ride to Sir Godfrey's rescue when he was about to be executed for murder, and Sir Godfrey would leap from the gallows onto the fairy's horse and ride off Fairyland. So, while there is a lot of variety among the different fairy stories, witch testimonies, and ballads, common patterns do emerge, and we can begin to see many of the elements that make up the fairies we see in modern fantasy fiction today. We've seen the idea of a fairy queen or a royal court, fairies returning a kindness offered or punishing unkind action, use of gifts or aid with strings attached to bind one to the fairy's service, people being kidnapped by fairies or choosing to go to Fairyland to escape the mortal world and becoming intermediaries. And we have seen the idea of multiple kinds of fairies, such as the more regal and human-like fairies, and the subordinate, smaller fairies, such as trolls or brownies. And so, with all those elements finally discovered, I feel that's an appropriate place to bring this episode to a close.
Yep, that works very well as a conclusion to our talk. It kind of has summed up everything that we've kind of gone over in many ways. Yeah, okay. So I'm just sat here slightly bewildered that it's finally finished.
It's been 5 hours.
Yeah, I've been trapped in this sweatbox of an office since 10 o'clock this morning. It's been an interesting time. I don't know about you, Crofty. I'm going to go and take a shower, probably put all the clothes I'm wearing in the wash, and try and move on with my life.
I'm going to go to the ramen shop, as we said earlier. I'm hungry.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to delay Crofty slightly longer just to say thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you sat through all 600 hours, then congratulations. You win a prize, and you don't have to listen anymore. And yeah, if you want to support this podcast at all in any further fashion, you can always pop on over to twitter.com/thehistocrat or _histocrat. I forget which I am. I've mostly forgotten whether I'm real or not at this point. And you can also support the podcast over on Patreon at patreon.com/thehistocrat. And as always, we appreciate our backers on there. And this was, in fact, a Patreon voted topic. I think I said at the very beginning of this. And someone's ringing my front doorbell. So I think that's about as good a moment as any for us to call an end. All right, folks. Yeah. Take care.
See you next time.
See you later. Hey folks, it's Charles here in post. So any of you listeners out there who were particularly, I was going to say eagle-eyed, but it's an audio platform, so eagle-eared. Is that a thing? Yeah, anyway, you probably noticed that we didn't do our usual practice of giving a few hints as to what the next episode is going to be. That's because we were completely out of it by the time we got to the end of this marathon recording session. We've not really done anything of comparable length in one go before. So, for example, those Bigfoot episodes, we split them up into 2 separate recording sessions, separated by nearly a month. So, yeah, we were a little worse for wear by the end of this, and we forgot to actually do that. So, it falls to me now to give you guys a bit of a hint for the next episode. So, we're finally going to do something that we've wanted to do for quite a while that may or may not be related to a certain relocation on the behalf of one of the hosts of this show in the last year or so. So we're going to be winging over to Southeast Asia for our next episode to look into the mythology of a country that is near and dear to the heart of at least one of us. And it seems we're going back again to the beginning, so to speak. Going to be doing another one of those pesky creation myths. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the episode. There is a dog barking in the background, and I'm hoping that's not getting picked up on the record. So I'm going to end this now before any more of that happens. Thanks again, folks. Love you, bye.